chance encounter sparks a fiery romance between a devoted single mom
She was searching for someone to make her happy.
and her dashing neighbor.
Everywhere she went, he was there.
But just when their passion reached a crescendo, an act of unspeakable evil shatters their lives forever.
I seen the blood on the walls of her bed.
She was stabbed, and they cut her throat.
The crime sparks an investigation that will uncover a twisted tale of love, deceit, and revenge, and leaves police and family wondering, was this the work of a cold-blooded stranger, or has danger been lurking in broad daylight?
I was like, oh, no, no, no. I couldn't believe it.
I felt suckered by my own intuition. I was so wrong.
It was a hunt. We were looking for you. You better hope they get you before we get you.
December 7th, 2010, 8:40 p.m. It's a chilly evening in the nation's capital, but as the last Beltway commuters make their way home, police receive a frantic 911 call. On the line is a young woman named Kiana Barnes.
Yeah, my mom's lying here and she's not responding.
I was like, it's blood everywhere. Y'all need to come.
Officers are dispatched to the Barnes apartment building in Southwest D.C. Meanwhile, the operator prods young Kiana for more information.
The dispatcher told her to pull the covers back and see whether or not her mother was still breathing.
I pulled the covers back. And that's when I seen she was stabbed over 10 times, her throat was sliced. I felt myself panicking, like losing breath. They kept telling me to calm down. It's a police officer en route.
Minutes later, first responders arrive on the scene.
She's in the
Is she this way? Can you show us where she's at?
A tearful Kiana quickly leads them into the bedroom. On the bed, they find the lifeless body of 41-year-old Tawana Barnes Copeland.
She had defensive wounds that would indicate that she was putting up her hands, trying to fight whoever was attacking her.
There were things thrown all over the room. There was a mantelpiece and things were knocked off of the mantel. Clearly, there was a horrible fight.
While responding officers escort Tawana's daughter away from the bloody scene in the bedroom, detectives arrive and begin the grim task of notifying the rest of Tawana's family. Before long, a stunned group of mourners has gathered outside her apartment building.
When that phone call went out, over 30 people showed up. So I was numb.
They had said that she was dead, but I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it.
No one can fathom who would want to harm Tawana. She was a single mom, grandmother, and universally beloved by all.
She was there for me. Everything I spoke to her about, everything I came to her about.
All the children, my daughter, everybody loved Tawana.
Tawana Barnes Copeland was born in Washington, D.C. in 1969. One of 8 children, Tawana grew up in a tight-knit, God-fearing family.
She was raised to basically, if you wanted something, you have to go out and get it.
From a young age, Tawana wanted one thing above all else.
When it came to Tawana and her dating life, she was looking for love.
Sweet and vivacious, Tawana had no trouble attracting attention from the opposite sex. At 18, she gave birth to her daughter, India, followed a few years later by Kiana. While the relationships with the children's 2 fathers ultimately fizzled, Tawana poured her heart and soul into her family and was determined to provide for them.
Children were the world to her. She kept them straight in line, but she loved all of them.
She started working in Halifax Community Hospital as a cook, and she went from working as a cook to becoming a phlebotomist.
Tawana had single-handedly fought her way up the ladder to build a great career and family. Still, at age 41, Tawana felt something was missing from her life.
She was searching for someone to make her happy. Love without a boundary, but when it comes to the opposite sex.
Tawana wanted a man who could match her drive and youthful energy.
Tawana didn't want no old man. No grandpa. She had a young spirit. She was fun. She had that pretty smile. A smile to like, come get me smile.
A dream that seemed to come true one day in 2010 when a young neighbor came to her rescue.
I'll tighten this last one and you should be good to go.
Well, thank you so much.
Hey, you're welcome, no big deal.
I don't know what I would have done without you.
Hey, I'm always helping people out, so. I'm Sean, by the way.
She was like, I want you to meet my friend. His name's Sean.
But you know you owe me, you know what I mean? Can I get your number?
As sweet-natured as he was good-looking, 36-year-old Sean Davis worked in the restaurant business in D.C. And like Tawana, he came from a big family.
He had like a young, down-to-earth type style. You know, he had his hair braided. He looked decent, like he had something for himself.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.
It only took a couple of dates for Tawana and Sean to become inseparable.
The chemistry between my mom and Sean was like, they was two young teenagers. Like, they was clothes everywhere she went, he was there.
Fueled by their desire for one another, Tawana soon asked Sean to move in with her. Tawana felt she had not only gained a lover, but a father figure for her family.
If me and Kiana asked him for something, he would be willing to give it to us, with no questions asked.
Sean was in love. He told me numerous of times how much he loved my mother, how much he cared about it.
I love you.
The relationship seemed picture perfect. But in the fall of 2010, Tawana abruptly decided she and Sean needed a break. According to Tawana, Sean lacked the drive and ambition that she expected from her man.
So I was like, Mom, what's wrong? He don't want to do nothing. He don't want to work. He don't want to do nothing. I'm not taking care of no grown man.
Tawana made him move from the bedroom to the couch. But Sean vowed to be there for Tawana whenever she wanted to reignite their romance.
He didn't understand why they broke up, and I would try to explain to him, well, you know, you gotta be patient with my mother. Like, you gotta listen sometimes. If she wants you to do something, do it.
Good morning.
Good morning, baby.
The new arrangement seemed to work out well for both of them. And maybe with time, Sean could prove he was a changed man.
And he kept telling her, and us, he wanted to be with a man. I love her. I love her.
Put your coat on.
Sean's willingness to give her the space she needed made Tawana's friends and family even more certain he was the man for her.
I have dinner ready for you when you get back.
Sean was a loving, caring person. Oh, okay, Ma, you found Mr. Right.
But before Tawana and Sean could officially patch things up, tragedy struck. Standing in Tawana's apartment that cold December night, investigators are struck by the brutality of the attack against her. As investigators search for answers, the question isn't just who murdered Tawana Barnes Copeland, but why.
Why would anyone want to take the life of such a caring person? And that's when the mystery really began.
Barnes Copeland longed to share her life with someone special. And that dream seemed to come true when she met the handsome and kind-hearted Sean Davis.
I'm Sean, by the way.
Tawana.
But shortly after they moved in together, Tawana unexpectedly put the brakes on their relationship. Friends and family believe Tawana and Sean will soon reunite. But that hope is snuffed out when police find Tawana brutally stabbed to death inside her apartment.
She was found in her bed. She had been stabbed several times, very deep wounds, 8 to 10 inches deep in the center of her torso.
Grieving friends and family converge outside Tawana's apartment building.
We were just heartbroken. We were really hurt. And we couldn't believe it.
Felt like I was crushed. Felt like my heart has just been taken out.
Huddled among them is a teary-eyed Sean Davis.
I actually called Sean, and he answered the phone, and I said, Sean, you know mommy got killed? He was like, what, for real? Are you serious?
While Sean and the rest of Tawana's loved ones grapple with their tragic loss, detectives question Tawana's daughter, Kiana.
Could you tell us what happened?
I came home. Mom, I'm home.
According to Kiana, she returned home to the apartment around 8:30 p.m. after spending the day with her boyfriend.
Mom, Matthew's gonna come over later.
As soon as I walked in my house, I noticed that my mom's room door was closed. I go in my mom's room, and I seen her landing.
Kiana saw she was asleep because she was under the covers. The mama not answering her. Mom! Mom!
I stood there for maybe 10, 15 minutes calling my mom's name, and she didn't answer me. And when I flipped my mom's room light on, that's when I seen the blood.
Kiana's description of the scene matches the one detectives have encountered.
There are a number of what we call defense wounds on her body, on the backside of her arms. Clearly, these wounds indicate a person that's trying to protect themselves from the ravages of somebody that's attacking them.
Kiana tells detectives her mother might have fended off her attacker had she not been hampered by an injury she'd suffered at work the night before.
She called me and she was like, Key, I'm in the emergency room. She tripped over a wheelchair and broke her knee.
She had difficulty moving. She went to the emergency room. They put a cast on her. They gave her crutches.
To detectives, Tawana's condition sparks a theory. Could someone, perhaps a thief working the surrounding area, have taken note of her delicate condition and marked her for an easy target?
The area is not the worst area, but it's not the best area either.
Surveying the scene, robbery certainly seems possible.
Did you see your mom's car when you came in?
No, I didn't notice.
What kind of car is it?
A black Honda Accord.
Can we sweep the parking lot for that car?
Yes, sir.
Did you notice anything else missing?
It looked like they just invaded my mom's room. Her purse was thrown everywhere. The stuff that was on her TV stand was on the floor.
The robbery theory gains traction when detectives identify a possible murder weapon.
There was a large kitchen knife that was missing, and that kitchen knife was never recovered.
Detectives now believe that whoever attacked Tawana had seized the first weapon they saw upon entering the house.
I thought someone either tried to break in or did break in, and they seen my mother in there, and my mother probably seen their face, and they killed my mom.
And the chilling story Kiana tells next only fuels the deadly robbery theory.
Could someone perhaps working the area like a thief mark your mom as an easy target?
I know we had a break-in a while ago.
The investigators learned Tawana's home had been broken into maybe 2 to 3 weeks prior to her murder.
They used a trash can to break into the back window.
According to Kiana, her mother had witnessed the entire terrifying event.
She caught them. She saw the whole thing.
There was someone that had placed a trash can underneath her window, and they were climbing up through her window into her apartment.
What in the hell? I know you're not trying to break into my house!
At that point, Tawana called the police.
Yes, ma'am, I just saw 2 men trying to break into my apartment.
The police arrived and ultimately caught the 2 people that were still in the area. She identified them and made it known that she, in fact, was the person who identified them.
Detectives can't help but wonder if the robbers had returned a second time to commit a far more heinous crime as payback.
One of the concerns that we had was whether or not this was a retaliatory murder. And in other words, that those people had retaliated against her and killed her for having identified them.
It's a chilling thought, one that seems to gel with Tawana's gruesome injuries.
They just kept stabbing and kept stabbing and kept stabbing until she was dead.
Excuse me, detective. We didn't find the car.
If you put an APB on that car, we need to find that car.
The victim's vehicle was missing. Someone had taken it.
It was suspected that the murderer may have taken it.
And whoever murdered Tawana appears to have entered the home in the exact same way the robbers did 2 weeks prior.
What do you got? I believe we have a possible point of entry.
Oh yeah, look at that.
There was a window that had been pushed out of the home, which could indicate that somebody had broken into the home by way of that window.
It increasingly appears Tawana Barnes Copeland is indeed the victim of a revenge killing committed by a would-be burglar. Detectives instruct officers back at police headquarters to pull the incident reports on the prior break-in at Tawana's apartment.
In an investigation, some things may just jump out at you. Obviously, as an investigator, you're going to look at the break-in at Tawana's home not long before the attack on her that morning of December 7th.
But new information is about to reveal an even more terrifying layer to this tragic story and leave detectives speculating Tawana wasn't the victim of a home invasion. Rather, she unwittingly invited her killer into a stable job, an adoring family, a man who loved her and gave her the space she needed to find true happiness. It seemed Tawana Barnes Copeland was living a fairy tale. But that fairy tale took a nightmarish turn when Tawana's daughter discovered her brutally stabbed to death inside her apartment.
It was heartbreaking. It was disgusting. And first thing was running through my mind was just, how can somebody even have the heart, the guts to even do that to somebody?
A missing vehicle along with an open window suggests a possible robbery. Detectives have also learned that Tawana had thwarted a similar attack a few weeks earlier.
She called the police and the detective told her to come outside to identify the dudes.
She identified those people. So one of the theories that was explored was whether or not her murder was maybe a retaliatory murder for her identification.
Investigators put out an APB on Tawana's vehicle and file a request for the incident report on the botched robbery. As for Tawana's friends and family, they're still in shock over the news of her death. No one seems more devastated than Tawana's daughter, Kiana, and Tawana's former boyfriend, Sean Davis.
Sean was upset. He missed my mom. He can't believe she's gone. He missed her so much. It took a lot out of him.
He loved her. He wanted to be with her. Now she's gone.
As Sean and Kiana struggled to cope with the heartache, police finally received the incident report from the initial break-in and identify a pair of suspects.
Whoever broke into the home decided to kill this woman because maybe she resisted. I have to find them.
While police scramble to locate these two men, detectives continue searching Tawana's apartment for additional evidence that might tie them to the crime.
They collected nearly everything that came from that apartment, all to see if it maybe could be later tested for DNA or fingerprints.
But as detectives take a closer look at the possible point of entry, they notice something unusual.
The window was open, and when police checked the locking mechanism, it appeared to work fine. Also, that was very suspicious was that the screen had been pushed out rather than pushed in.
Which suggests they entered the apartment in some other fashion and then fled through the window. But where exactly is that point of entry? As detectives try to solve this puzzle, they receive a call that changes everything.
They're not our guys. We found out that those people were actually incarcerated at the time of the murder.
But if the two men who originally broke into Tawana's residence aren't responsible for her murder, then who is? Tawana's gruesome injuries may offer a clue.
She was stabbed at least 12 times. Her throat was slit. This person was obviously very passionate about her.
It was definitely a more emotional case than you typically have. A lot of times there can just be a random killing, or here you could tell that it was very personal.
Speaking to family members, detectives learned that Tawana recently put the brakes on her and Sean's budding romance and banished Sean to the couch while she figured things out.
They was together before, and, she felt sorry for him at the same time. So, okay, all right, you can sleep right here, but we're not sleeping in the same bed.
Is it possible that a lovelorn Sean may have murdered Tawana? Friends and family think the theory is absurd.
Sean was at the house, the cookouts and everything else, and it couldn't be Sean.
When police question him, Sean seems torn apart by Tawana's death.
Can we speak to you just a minute? Oh, sure.
More importantly, Sean seems to have an airtight alibi.
Where were you when all this happened? I was at work. I came over as soon as I heard about it.
He was very cooperative with the investigation. He told the police he had been at work all day.
Sean's supervisor at work ultimately corroborates his statement.
He worked at Kitchen Match Temporaries. It was a temp agency. Sean Davis arrived there in actuality about 11.
Sorry for your loss. If we have any more questions, we'll reach out to you.
With Sean's alibi all but eliminating him as a suspect, the investigation appears to have hit a dead end. Until the coroner's office issues their findings on Tawana's cause of death.
The wounds were consistent from being inflicted from a person who was left-handed.
Whoever had this knife was left-handed. Everybody thinking, who left-handed, who left-handed?
Police quickly zero in on one individual, the person closest to Tawana, the person who placed the 911 call the night of the crime, her daughter, Kiana.
They asked me if I was left-handed. So I'm like, yes, I'm left-handed, not knowing they asking me these questions for a reason.
Kiana is left-handed, and so was the killer. But, you wouldn't think that Kiana would ever hurt her mother.
But But it isn't just Kiana's left hand that caught investigators' attention. It's what they heard when they closely examined her 911 call.
She was the one that called the police, and if you listen to it, it sounds like Kiana's laughing.
Could Tawana's own flesh and blood have committed this terrible crime? Investigators bring Kiana in for questioning, starting with the timeline Kiana initially laid out for them.
Let me get this straight. You said you got home, waited 10 to 15 minutes calling your mom, but you never bothered to check on her?
Well, yeah, I mean, I thought she was sleeping.
They treated me as though, okay, well, how we know that you didn't kill your mom?
As the interrogation intensifies, so does Kiana's belligerence.
That's what I said.
They kept telling me to calm down, but to me it felt as though they just kept asking me the same questions and then trying to reverse the questions. I told the detective, do you really think I'm crazy? Do I look like the person that can stand over you 10 times and slice your throat?
Whoever killed your mom was left-handed. You're left-handed, so we got a problem.
I'm innocent. I'm telling you I'm innocent.
Okay, so if you didn't do it, then who did?
That's when Kiana drops a bombshell.
Bo.
I believed it was Bo. I thought it was Bo.
According to Kiana, while taking time to sort out her feelings for Sean, Tawana had met a man named Bo, a security guard at the hospital where she worked. Although she'd only met him once, Tawana's daughter had a bad feeling about Bo.
When I first met him, his body language seemed fishy.
Just 2 weeks after meeting Bo, Tawana was dead. To Kiana, the timing seemed like more than just a coincidence.
I didn't see no one else doing it to my mom but him.
But given her defiant attitude, detectives can't figure out if Kiana is telling the truth or trying to deflect attention away from herself.
You're going to continue to follow that person and watch that person, make sure they don't skip town. But you know that at some point, you're going to zero in.
It's been nearly 48 hours since police found Tawana Barnes Copeland stabbed to death inside the bedroom of her Washington, D.C. apartment. After ruling out a pair of petty street criminals, police have learned that Tawana's attacker was left-handed, which shifts the focus of their investigation to her daughter, Kiana. But Kiana has put another possible suspect on the table, a mystery man named Bo, who Tawana started seeing after she put her romance with live-in boyfriend Sean Davis on hold.
I thought maybe it was her friend Bo. I didn't know him, I just met him. And then like soon as my mom meets you, she's dead. How could this happen so fast?
Unsure if Kiana is telling the truth or trying to throw them off her own trail, investigators ask Tawana's friends and family if Kiana might be capable of murder.
We were like, no. Are you serious? Are you crazy? We're cursing the police out. Are you effing crazy? Get the hell out of here with that. No way. That's her mother. She loved her mother. She loved her mother.
In addition, Kiana seems to have an airtight alibi. According to Kiana's boyfriend, Matthew Salgado, she was with him the day the murder took place. But what about the 10 to 15 minute window between the time Kiana arrived home and the time she called 911? Ironically, the same autopsy report that cast a shadow of doubt over the left-handed Kiana ultimately exonerates her.
The autopsy could not really provide a specific time. They could just say that the murder had probably occurred 8 to 12 hours before she was discovered that evening.
That meant Tawana had been lying dead in her apartment since approximately 8:30 a.m. the morning of December 7th, a time that detectives can confirm Kiana was at the home of her boyfriend, Matthew Salgado. With Kiana eliminated as a suspect, investigators turn their attention to Tawana's mysterious new suitor, Bo. At first, investigators only know this mystery man by his first name, but a little digging reveals Bo is the nickname of Larry Thomas.
He was a nice-looking guy, 5'6", 5'7", short haircut, typical young-looking dude.
According to her family, Bo had taken an interest in Tawana shortly after she decided to cool things off with live-in boyfriend Sean Davis.
I had a really good time tonight.
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah?
Then, just 5 days before her murder, Tawana invited Bo back to her house.
The first date that Tawana and Bo went on was at the IHOP. The first time me and Kiana met Bo was that night when he came to the house. Bo acted like he didn't want to shake my hand. I don't know why.
Bo's coldness immediately rubbed Kiana and her boyfriend the wrong way. and Kiana made it clear how she felt about him.
I gave him the normal, typical child. You dating my mom, look, gave him the up and down. What's up with you? Every question I asked him was like short answer, like, okay, hurry up, get your daughter out of my face.
As for Sean, who was still crashing on Tawana's couch, he tried to make the best of an awkward situation. But when Bo found out Tawana's on-again, off-again ex-boyfriend still lived with her, he became upset.
I thought Bo was kind of jealous because when my mom brought Bo to the house to meet us, Sean was in the living room on a pull-out sofa.
Detectives believe they finally found a motive that fits the crime: jealousy.
The investigators were very concerned about Bo because if you really look at the timeline, here he comes, and then less than 3 weeks later, she ends up dead.
I thought Bo took it as though my mother was playing with him or, was like using him.
Investigators begin a search for Larry Thomas, a.k.a. Bo, but Thomas is nowhere to be found. With Bo MIA, Tawana's family decides to take matters into their own hands.
It was a hunt. You better hope they get you before we get you. That's how it was. That's how we feel.
With nearly everyone in Tawana's extended family scouring the area for clues, it doesn't take long for one of them, Tawana's street-smart cousin Patrick Wilson, to hunt Bo down. According to a friend, Bo had been spotted hanging out at a local recording studio. Patrick informs police and makes his way to the studio to confront Bo himself.
I rode over to the studio, took out, I had a firearm. My friend came to his door.
What's going on?
He was like, man, let me talk to you first. I said, ain't no need to talk, homeboy. Excuse me. He here? I need to see him.
Hey, let me holler at Bo. Put the gun away and I'll go get him.
You go get him then, you do that.
Chill, man.
Moments later, Bo emerges from the recording studio.
And you killed Tawana.
Hey, you killed Tawana. No, I ain't killed Tawana, man. I didn't kill Tawana.
He said, man, I ain't had nothing to do with this.
Just listen to what I'm saying, man. I didn't kill Tawana.
But as Bo attempts to explain himself, an officer arrives on the scene.
Back up, man. What's going on? Come over here and talk. What's going on? Nothing going on, man. You just came up here. All right, relax.
He places Bo in the squad car and calls in detectives.
Bo was a primary person of interest in this case.
With Bo in custody, detectives hope they've finally found Tawana's killer. A possibility that proves even more likely when they make a shocking discovery.
You got my cousin car right over there. That black Honda. Right there, he stole it.
He had her car. I thought you did something to Tawana, Bo, and now you stole her car.
You got her car. She's dead. No weapon. No nothing. So, how you get her car?
It appears investigators are one step closer to solving the murder of Tawana Barnes Copeland. But a shocking revelation will soon lead detectives to wonder. Are they staring to ruling out several suspects, including her daughter Kiana and her boyfriend-turned-roommate Sean Davis? Police now believe Tawana's new love interest, Bo, a.k.a. Larry Thomas, is responsible for the murder of 41-year-old Tawana Barnes Copeland.
It appeared as though Bo was the person who could have been on the scene at the time of this altercation because he had her vehicle.
Everything in me was just saying, this man killed your mother. He did it.
Thanks to Tawana's cousin Patrick Wilson, police now have Bo in custody. And as CSIs process Tawana's vehicle for evidence, detectives grill Bo about the murder. While Bo denies any involvement in the crime, he admits seeing Tawana in the hours just prior to her death.
She was at work, she was injured, and she called Bo to come pick her up about 3 o'clock in the morning, and then drove her to her home, dropped her off, made sure she got safely into her bedroom.
What happened when you took her home?
Nothing. Nothing happened. She went to bed. I told her I would call her in the morning, and I left.
Bo tells detectives he went to work early that morning and tried to call Tawana several times during the course of the day.
Man, I called her all day, and she never answered her phone.
You got her car?
I drove her home from work, all right? So she let me borrow it.
She had allowed him to use her vehicle so that he could get back and forth to work.
Come on, man. You killed her. You were jealous of all these other men.
No, that's not true.
Bo maintains he had nothing to do with the crime, But detectives believe the forensic evidence collected at the crime scene and in Tawana's car will link him to her murder.
We're also looking for fruits of evidence of the crime itself, whether or not the weapon used was in that vehicle, whether or not there's any blood stains in that vehicle. So the vehicle, most of the time, especially in a homicide case, is very, very critical.
But CSI's findings are surprisingly inconclusive.
They checked the car. Wasn't no evidence of blood. Wasn't nothing in the car.
Shortly after that, investigators receive a call from Beau's employer, who confirms Beau's story that he was at work at the time of the murder.
Beau's supervisor was contacted, and everything that Beau said, it was the truth.
Still, investigators aren't ready to rule out Beau as a suspect. They decide to subpoena the phone records of both Beau and Tawana. As detectives wait for a judge to sign off on the subpoena, Tawana's family begins planning her funeral.
I was angry, I was upset, I was sad, I was hysterical. I just wanted to get out of there. I just wanted to go home to my mother. I just couldn't deal with none of this. Why would somebody do this to my mom?
Thankfully, Kiana can depend on the love and support of Sean Davis, Tawana's on-again, off-again boyfriend, whose love for Tawana and her daughter was unwavering.
The day before the funeral, I shook Sean's hand and telling him thank you for trying to look after Kiana.
As Sean, Kiana, and the rest of the family put the finishing touches on Tawana's funeral arrangements, the subpoena for Beau and Tawana's cell phone records is finally approved.
His phone records, as well as the caller ID in Tawana's apartment, indicated that he was trying to call her all day, consistent with his promise, and it's aligned perfectly with where he said he was, which was out in Prince George's County, far away from the murder.
Though Beau's cell phone records seem to solidify his alibi, when investigators check Tawana's phone records, they make a startling discovery.
10:35 a.m., Tawana Barnes' cell phone was on the move, and it was pinging off a cell tower in northwest Washington, D.C. And this is a woman who we know was in no shape to be gallivanting around the city.
More importantly, how did Tawana's cell phone end up across town some 2 hours after her estimated time of death? Investigators check businesses in the area and uncover something shocking.
It was pinging off a cell tower, which was pretty much directly on top of Sean Davis's work. And at the same time, Sean Davis's phone was also making calls, pinging off that very same cell phone tower.
Is it a coincidence? Or could Tawana's doting boyfriend turned best friend have had a hand in her murder? A brutal stabbing left 41-year-old Tawana Barnes Copeland dead, and her family searching for answers. While her killer remains at large, phone records indicate that Tawana's ex-flame, Sean Davis, was in possession of her cell phone shortly after her murder.
Cell site records showed that that phone was located in the area of Sean Davis's work. But right after that call, the phone turned off and never turned on again.
The phone records also show Sean and Tawana had spoken multiple times in the hours leading up to her death, which contradicts Sean's initial statement. Still, investigators have a hard time believing Sean is Tawana's killer. For starters, his alibi that he was working all day checked out. And in the days since the murder, Sean had been the rock that propped up Tawana's grieving loved ones. But as detectives dig deeper, a less flattering picture of Sean begins to emerge.
Tawana and Sean has been in some fights before. He wanted her to stay with him. He wanted her to be with him. He wanted her as his girlfriend, and she didn't want that any longer.
Sean was pretty upset about Tawana moving on and doing whatever she wanted to do, and he still loved her. He was really mad.
On December 12, 2010, detectives bring Sean Davis in for questioning.
He admitted that Tawana Barnes Copeland was his ex-girlfriend, that they had broken up and he had been jealous over her relationship with other men, but he still cared very deeply for her.
Though he was hurt when Tawana moved on, Sean insists he would never harm her and maintains he hadn't seen or even spoken to Tawana the day she died. But when presented with cell phone records, Sean's story begins to shift.
The phone record says you talked that morning. Oh, yeah. That's right, yeah. She called me, wanted some help filling out a prescription.
Sean now claims he did speak to Tawana the day she was murdered.
She asked him if he would help to fill her prescriptions that morning. He said, I'll get to it later. The detectives pressed him on that point. You know, this is someone that you cared about. She had had this accident. She was in pain, and you just told her that you would get back to her later? That doesn't make sense.
So you're telling me you weren't at Tawana that morning? Yeah. How do you explain her cell phone pinged off a tower near your job? I don't know. I didn't have it.
That's when detectives throw Sean a curveball.
Sean, are you right-handed or left-handed? Left-handed. Why you ask?
Sean Davis was left-handed, and this was significant because the wounds were consistent from being inflicted from a person who was left-handed.
All right, stand up.
It's not much, but based on the phone records, Sean's ever-changing stories, and the fact that he is left-handed, police decide to charge Sean Davis with Tawana's murder. Friends and family simply can't believe it.
The detectives called me and said, we found out who killed your mom. And I was like, thank you, Jesus. Who was it? He took a deep sigh and was like, it was Sean. And I was like, who? And he was like, it was Sean.
But that trust in Sean begins to change at his preliminary hearing.
At first, he was smiling, talking, but once he looked over and seen me sitting right there, it's like his whole mood changed.
Reading from the indictment, prosecutors assert that on the morning of December 7th, 2010, Tawana asked Sean Davis to help her fill out a pain prescription.
Can you help me fill this out for my prescription, please?
Sure, baby. I'll do anything for you.
But before they left the apartment, Sean confronted Tawana about her new friend, Bo.
So, how'd you get home?
Bo dropped me off.
Bo dropped you off? Why you ain't call me? You know I'm always here for you.
I believe that he was jealous of Tawana's new romantic interest with Bo. He wanted to be with her, but she was interested in being with someone else.
According to prosecutors, when Tawana rejected Sean's advances, he snapped.
Did you just put your hands on me?
He grabbed a knife out of the kitchen, came back into the room where Tawana was, and he proceeded to stab her.
I think that just pushed Sean to his limit, like, okay, she really don't want to be with me no more, and she's basically moved on, and he didn't.
Prosecutors allege Sean stabbed Tawana over 12 times and then slashed her throat in one final act of rage.
The pieces of the puzzle came together. He was so much in love with her that he felt no other man could have her. Crime of passion.
After he realized what he'd done, Sean panicked, stole Tawana's cell phone, and staged the window to look like a break-in.
Sean Davis knew about that prior case, and so it made a lot of sense that he then decided to stage the burglary, particularly opening up the window.
Prosecutors assert Sean's plan might have worked, had it not been for one crucial slip-up.
Tawana's phone was ringing in the area in which Sean supposed to have been at work. So he had Tawana's phone the entire time. Then he gets rid of the phone by his job. Smart man. And I say that sarcastically.
But after the preliminary hearing, Sean Davis makes another unexpected move. With evidence mounting against him, he pleads guilty to Tawana's murder. The judge sentences him to 18 years in prison.
He copped the plea because he know he's done. His goose was cooked.
He said the reason he did it was because he wanted to be with her, but she didn't want to be with him, and he couldn't accept that it was a stupid mistake, and he was sorry.
For Tawana's loved ones, the verdict is a bittersweet reward.
The desert heat of Phoenix, Arizona, has a way of bleaching the color out of everything it touches, including the most guarded secrets of the elite. But it could never quite erase the shadow that settled over the Biltmore estates in the summer of 1985. It was a time of excess, neon lights, and the intoxicating promise of the American dream, a landscape where money didn't just buy comfort. It bought silence. But silence is a fragile commodity when the desert winds begin to howl, and for one prominent millionaire, a man whose name was synonymous with civic pride and high society galas, the past was about to come roaring back with the force of a sandstorm. It started not with a confession, but with the chilling, rhythmic thud of federal boots against the marble floors of a private mansion. the sound of a dream collapsing in real time. Millions watched from behind their screens as the man who had shaped the skyline of the city, a titan of real estate and a darling of the philanthropic circuit, was led out in chains, his silver fox hair disheveled, his eyes darting toward the cameras as if searching for a loophole in the reality of his own undoing. This was the sudden, violent death of a long-standing reputation, the moment a 1985 cold case that had haunted the dusty archives of the Phoenix PD finally shattered the gilded cage of a murderer who had lived as a king for 4 decades, proving that in the end, even the tallest skyscrapers of vanity cannot hide the skeletons buried beneath the foundation. To understand the magnitude of this arrest, we have to travel back to a night in mid-July 1985, a night when the monsoon season turned the sky into a bruised, volatile purple, and the air hung heavy with the smell of scorched earth and impending rain. Clara Sterling, a 24-year-old socialite and rising star in the local art world, had vanished from a high-profile fundraiser hosted by the very man who, 40 years later, would find himself in the back of a police cruiser. She was a woman of ambition, a bright light in a city that often favored the quiet over the bold, and her disappearance was treated with a strange, calculated indifference by the circles she frequented. The party had been an affair of champagne, tuxedos, and the kind of networking that builds empires, but when the music stopped and the last of the limousines pulled away, Clara was nowhere to be found. The subsequent investigation was a theater of the absurd. Evidence was mishandled. Witnesses with high-priced attorneys suddenly developed convenient bouts of amnesia, and the official report was filed under a label of probable runaway, a term that effectively buried the truth under a mountain of bureaucratic apathy. The community, distracted by the relentless growth of the city and the lure of the boom years, allowed the story of Clara Sterling to fade into the desert air, turning a potential tragedy into a footnote that was quickly forgotten by those who had the most to lose. The mansion where the arrest took place was a sprawling, Mediterranean-style fortress on the edge of the foothills, a property that had served as the hub of the city's power for generations, a place where business deals were sealed in the glow of the sunset and reputations were manufactured out of thin air. It was a site of immense prestige, but for the task force that breached its gates, it was simply a crime scene that had been left untouched for far too long. As the agents moved through the opulent rooms, past the priceless artifacts and the velvet-lined walls, they were not just serving a warrant. They were dismantling a mythology. The millionaire, Arthur Sterling, no relation to the victim, he had always claimed, though the records told a different story, had built his entire persona on a foundation of absolute control, a man who had seemingly mastered the art of being everywhere at once, a benefactor of the arts, a champion of the environment, and a ghost who had walked away from a murder scene with nothing but a smile and a bank account that grew by the millions. The shock of his arrest paralyzed the high society circles of the Southwest, forcing people to confront the possibility that the very men they had toasted at charity galas were the same ones who had left a trail of blood across the history of the city. The breakthrough, the one that turned the cold case from a dormant file into an active hunt, came from the most unlikely of places, the quiet, meticulous work of a retired forensic analyst who had spent her final years digitizing the analog records of the 1980s. It was a microscopic detail, a smudge of carbon on a witness statement that had been dismissed as irrelevant in 1985, that pointed toward a hidden, off-the-books security footage reel that had been lost during the original investigation. Using modern enhancements, the task force was able to extract a sequence of grainy, black-and-white frames from that reel, a sequence that showed Arthur Sterling leading a young woman toward a side exit of the mansion moments before the storm hit. It was a visual timestamp of the end of Clara Sterling's life, a digital resurrection of a moment that had been buried in the vaults of the police station for nearly 40 years. The match was undeniable, the geometry of the figures unmistakable, and the revelation that this footage had been suppressed by someone within the department sent a tremor through the local legal system that was felt as far away as Washington. What followed was a slow, deliberate tightening of the net, a tactical exercise in patience that required the coordination of multiple federal agencies to ensure that Sterling couldn't use his immense legal resources to slip through the cracks once more. They tapped into the financial records that had been kept in the shadows, tracing the movement of illicit funds that had been used to buy off witnesses and silence the journalists who had initially tried to dig into the Sterling disappearance. They found that Arthur Sterling hadn't just murdered a woman. He had sustained a multi-decade cover-up that involved at least a dozen individuals in positions of power, a shadow hierarchy that had effectively turned the city's justice system into an extension of his own corporate interests. The arrest was not just about the cold case. It was about the systematic corruption of a city, the revelation that the gold-plated years of Phoenix were built on a foundation of complicity and fear. As the news spread, the atmosphere in Phoenix shifted from shock to a strange, lingering sense of betrayal. The city, which had always viewed its pioneers and its millionaires with a kind of reverent distance, was forced to look at the foundations of its own success. The arrest of Sterling opened a floodgate of reports from people who had worked for him, people who had witnessed the petty cruelties and the cold, surgical efficiency he employed in both his business and his private life. The narrative began to coalesce into a damning portrait of a man who viewed people as assets to be managed or, if they became liabilities, as problems to be liquidated. The high society of Phoenix, which had once treated Sterling as an untouchable icon, now scrambled to distance themselves, a frantic, desperate effort to scrub his name from their programs and his signature from their donations, creating a spectacle of hypocrisy that only added to the biting irony of the situation. The trial, which began in the blistering heat of midsummer, was a spectacle of legal maneuvering, with Sterling's defense team employing every trick in the book to suppress the newly found evidence, to discredit the investigators, and to frame the prosecution as a politically motivated witch hunt. But the sheer weight of the physical evidence, combined with the testimony of people who had finally found the courage to speak after years of intimidation, built a narrative that no amount of rhetoric could disassemble. The courtroom became a window into the past, a place where the ghostly memories of 1985 were brought into the searing light of the 21st century, revealing a man who had not changed, but had simply gotten better at hiding. It was a visceral experience for the jury, a group of people who had grown up in the city that Sterling had built, and who now had to decide whether the man who had shaped their skyline was a builder or a destroyer of lives. There was a moment during the middle of the trial when Sterling, while on the stand, experienced a flicker of his old, unshakable arrogance, a smirk that he had worn through 1,000 board meetings, only for it to dissolve into a hollow, empty stare when the lead prosecutor held up the silver locket that had been recovered from the storm drain near the mansion grounds. It was the locket Clara had been wearing the night she died, a small, fragile thing that had survived the passage of time when so much else had been erased. The sight of it seemed to break the man, the facade of the millionaire entrepreneur momentarily giving way to the terrified, pathetic reality of a person who had spent 40 years running from the truth. It was the turning point of the trial, the moment the jury saw through the veneer of prestige to the stark, unforgiving reality of the crime. As the verdict was read, the room fell into a silence, so profound it felt as if the entire city of Phoenix had paused to listen.
Guilty.
The word didn't just end a trial, it closed a chapter of history, the final, inevitable conclusion to a tragedy that had begun when the world was a very different place. Sterling, who had once been the master of his own fate, was led away, the iron bars of the holding cell serving as a brutal, literal check on the power he had once wielded so indiscriminately. There was no grandeur to his departure, no sense of the drama he had cultivated throughout his life. There was only the cold, mechanical reality of a man who had finally been made accountable. The high society he had commanded was gone. The buildings he had constructed remained, but the architect himself was a ghost, a remnant of a past that had been finally and definitively locked away. The legacy of the 1985 Phoenix case goes beyond the conviction of one man. It is a story about the endurance of memory, about the way that even in a world obsessed with the present, the echoes of the past can never be truly silenced. The desert wind that blows through the foothills may cover the tracks of a crime for a time, but it cannot hide the truth forever. The case serves as a warning, a reminder to those who believe that money, power, and reputation are shields against the consequences of their actions. Phoenix, a city built on the concept of constant reinvention, has learned that the only way to truly build a future is to first and finally reckon with the truth of its past. As the sun sets over the Valley of the Sun, the city remains, the buildings stay, but the shadow that once hung over the Biltmore estates is gone, replaced by the quiet, settling weight of justice. The story of Clara Sterling is finally a story of closure, a narrative that has reached its end after nearly half a century of waiting. For the families, for the investigators, and for a community that had lived under the cloud of the Sterling myth, the conclusion is a relief, a release from the lingering, heavy presence of a ghost that had been walking among them for far too long. The cold case is solved, the millionaire is in his cell, and the desert, with its vast, uncaring patience, continues its cycle, no longer burdened by the secret of the man who thought he could outrun the truth. In the final, still hours of the night, when the heat of the day has faded into a cool, sharp silence, the memory of the 1985 case remains as a benchmark for the power of the light. It is a story of how a small, almost invisible detail can bridge the gap between decades, how the tools of the modern age can be turned against the monsters of the past, and how, in the end, justice is the only currency that never devalues. Sterling's mansion stands empty, a monument to a collapsed ambition, the silence within its walls no longer a sanctuary, but a tomb. The city of Phoenix, once the playground of the untouchable, is a different place now, a city that knows the value of the light and the cost of the dark. And for those who knew Clara, for those who remembered the girl who loved art and life, the resolution is a long overdue act of kindness, a final, necessary grace that allows them to finally, truly, say goodbye to the ghost of the desert. The arrest of Arthur Sterling was merely the initial strike in a much larger, more surgical operation designed to dismantle the entire infrastructure of a 40-year cover-up. While the media descended upon the Biltmore estate in a frenzy of flashbulbs and live reports, the federal task force was already operating in the silent, clinical space of the investigative deep dive. They weren't just building a murder case, they were mapping the anatomy of an untouchable life. Inside the mansion, the agents discovered that Sterling hadn't just been wealthy. He had been the nexus of a shadow network that had influenced zoning boards, municipal contracts, and even the local judiciary for 3 decades. His mansion was a repository of leverage. As the forensic team began to extract files from the hidden wall safes and encrypted server arrays installed in his private study, they realized that the murder of Clara Sterling in 1985 had not been a messy, impulsive act of passion, but the violent birth of a corporate predator. He had killed her because she knew, because she had dared to look at his ledgers, and then he had used the chaos of her death to consolidate his power, effectively laundering his guilt through the rapid development of the city itself. The investigators discovered that every major real estate acquisition Sterling had made between 1986 and 1995 could be traced back to the same illicit slush fund that had been used to silence the witnesses in the Clara Sterling case. It was a cycle of blood and mortar. Each successful skyscraper he built was essentially a tombstone for a secret he had buried, a way of laundering not just his money, but his past. The task force found notarized documents, private memos, and audio logs that detailed how Sterling had systematically bribed the lead investigators of the 1985 investigation, turning the police department's efforts into a performative charade. They had spent months chasing leads that Sterling himself had planted, while he sat in his office on the 40th floor, watching them like a puppeteer playing with broken toys. The level of institutional rot was staggering, a sobering reminder of how easily the systems meant to protect a community can be bought by someone who understands the exact price of a human soul. As the team continued their forensic audit of the mansion, they found a secondary, smaller vault located behind a bookshelf in the master bedroom, a space so small and so expertly concealed that it had been missed during a sweep by local authorities decades ago. Inside were Clara Sterling's personal effects, not just the locket that had cracked the case, but her diary, her sketches, and a series of letters she had been writing to a friend, detailing her growing suspicion that the man she admired was not a philanthropist, but a financial parasite. The diary was the final, devastating piece of evidence, a narrative of her last days that moved from curiosity to profound, suffocating fear. The detectives, hardened by years of viewing the worst of humanity, found themselves reading these entries in a silence that was thick with the weight of decades. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was the voice of a girl who had been erased, a voice that had been waiting 40 years to be heard. The entries detailed her discovery of the slush fund, her plan to go to the press, and the terrifying, prophetic realization that Sterling knew she was watching him. The legal fallout began to ripple through the city, tearing the masks off figures who had stood beside Sterling for decades. Those who had been his business associates, his silent partners, and his political enablers started to panic, the walls closing in as the task force began issuing subpoenas by the dozens. The high society circles of Phoenix, once defined by the exclusive, invitation-only nature of their gatherings, were suddenly filled with the nervous, shifting energy of people who were all wondering if their own names were on the lists the feds were slowly unspooling. The trial preparation became a logistical odyssey, requiring a specialized facility to house the sheer volume of paper and digital evidence being unearthed from Sterling's estate. It wasn't just a murder case, it was a societal purge. The investigators were working 18-hour days, fueled by the knowledge that this was the definitive moment of reckoning, the chance to finally close the book on a story that had been written in shadows for far too long. The psychological profile the investigators were building on Sterling was increasingly dark, revealing a man who had never really aged out of the sociopathy that had fueled his initial crime. He was not a man who felt the weight of his years. He was a man who felt only the weight of his legacy. His conversations, recorded through bugged phone lines and office microphones, revealed a person who spoke of Clara not as a victim, but as a necessary cost of doing business, a phrase that, in the context of a 24-year-old's life, was so utterly devoid of empathy that it left even the most cynical investigators feeling a chill. He didn't live in the past, because in his mind, the past had been completely neutralized, assimilated into the present by his success. He was a man who had successfully rewritten his own history, and he seemed genuinely surprised, almost offended, when the modern world dared to challenge the reality he had created. The local media, meanwhile, had turned into a relentless force for the truth, with investigative journalists digging into their own archives to find the stories they had been suppressed from writing in the 1980s. They interviewed the retired detectives who had been pushed off the case, the secretaries who had been fired for asking questions, and the family members of the witnesses who had been threatened. It was an awakening, a collective effort to unearth the truth that had been kept in the desert for 4 decades. The story of the Phoenix 1985 cold case was becoming a meta-narrative about how a community allows itself to be deceived, about the dangerous intersection of power and silence, and about the long, slow, and often painful process of coming to terms with the dark side of a city's own history. There was a peculiar, almost ghostly quality to the mansion now, an aura of finality that settled over the estate as the feds moved their equipment in. The opulence felt diminished, the marble floors and the grand architecture of the power he had once wielded now seeming like nothing more than a stage set for a play that had finally reached its final scene. Arthur Sterling, stripped of his suits, his private jets, and his ability to command the room, was forced to sit in a holding cell, staring at a concrete wall, a man who had finally lost the only thing he had ever truly cared about, his control. The investigators noted that he didn't look at the files, didn't talk to his lawyers, and didn't seem to notice the cameras. He was a man who had been hollowed out by the sudden, violent collapse of his myth, the reality of his own mortality finally catching up to him in the cold, windowless space of the detention center. As the legal proceedings moved toward the grand jury indictment, the sheer scale of the corruption became the headline. It wasn't just the murder of Clara Sterling, it was the systemic exploitation of the city's resources, the manipulation of the tax codes, and the weaponization of the legal system to protect a predator. The indictment was thousands of pages long, a document that detailed a lifetime of predation, a case study in how a man can hide his sins behind a skyline of his own making. The public began to view the buildings Sterling had built, the parks he had sponsored, and the foundations he had led not as contributions to the city, but as monuments to his own impunity, a stark, physical reminder of what can be bought when the price is someone else's life. The task force's lead investigator, a man named Miller who had spent his entire career in the shadow of the Sterling myth, was frequently seen at the mansion at night, walking the grounds and looking out over the city lights. He knew that this wasn't just about the murder. It was about the truth that had been buried in the desert for 40 years. He had seen the way Sterling moved, the way he thought, and he knew that beneath the exterior of the millionaire, there was nothing but a void. The case was a testament to the fact that no matter how deep you bury the truth, no matter how much you build on top of it, the truth is not a thing that can be suppressed indefinitely. It is like the desert itself. It has a way of shifting, of exposing what lies beneath the surface, and eventually forcing a reckoning with the past. The families of other victims, people whose loved ones had disappeared under suspicious circumstances during Sterling's rise to power, began to contact the task force in a slow, steady stream. It was an unprecedented wave of potential leads, a realization that the Clara Sterling case might just be the tip of a much larger, more terrible iceberg. The task force established a dedicated division to vet these claims, a team of detectives who spent their days and nights listening to stories that had been buried for decades. It was a massive, decentralized operation, one that was changing the very definition of cold case investigation. The Phoenix case was the catalyst for a fundamental change in the way the city and the state approached the past, a shift from an attitude of let sleeping dogs lie to a new, proactive commitment to finding the truth, no matter how inconvenient it might be. As the second phase of the investigation drew to a close, the focus returned to the singular, tragic story of Clara Sterling. The diary, the locket, and the recordings were all being cataloged for the trial, each item a piece of a story that was finally being allowed to be told in full. The detectives were no longer just looking at the evidence. They were looking at the life that had been interrupted, a life that had been so full of promise, art, and ambition. They were doing this for her, for the girl who had been erased, and for the hope that even after 40 years, justice could still find its way into the desert. The house of cards was down, the myth was shattered, and the man who had thought he was a king was now simply a man who was finally and irrevocably on his way to a final, permanent judgment for the life he had stolen. The cold case was not just solved, it was being meticulously, piece by piece, restored, ensuring that the legacy of 1985 would finally be a legacy of truth, and not a legacy of the lie that Sterling had tried to force on the world. The architecture of David Sterling's silence did not shatter with a single blow. It eroded with the agonizing, mechanical precision of a federal audit that left no stone unturned in the desert of his influence. By the third month of the investigation, the task force had moved from the initial, visceral shock of the mansion arrest to the cold, clinical reality of the discovery phase. They were no longer just looking at the murder of Clara Sterling. They were uncovering a parallel history of Phoenix, a city built on the bones of those who had dared to be obstacles to the Sterling Empire. The task force had established a dedicated forensic facility, a war room filled with the artifacts of a lifetime of deception, where the walls were plastered with the timelines of acquisitions, the flowcharts of offshore accounts, and the haunting, black-and-white photos of the 1985 crime scene, now re-examined with the light of 1,000 modern data points. It was here, amidst the hum of servers and the quiet, intense focus of the analysts, that the true, terrifying scale of Arthur Sterling's pathology began to emerge. He wasn't just a man who had committed a crime. He was a man who had incorporated the crime into his very existence, using the murder of a 24-year-old artist as the foundational stone for an empire of glass and steel. The investigators discovered that the slush fund identified in the early weeks was only the beginning of a complex, three-tiered financial apparatus. Sterling had not been hoarding cash. He had been weaponizing it. They tracked millions in wire transfers that aligned perfectly with the silence of key witnesses in the mid-'80s, money that had been routed through a labyrinthine network of shell companies, many of which had been dissolved within hours of the original investigation's closure. It was a masterclass in obfuscation, a strategy that required not just a killer, but an army of complicit accountants, lawyers, and political fixers who had all traded their ethics for a piece of the Sterling prosperity. The team began identifying these individuals, many of whom were now elderly, living in quiet retirement in the very suburbs they had helped Sterling construct. The task force didn't just target the millionaire. They began targeting the enablers, the people who had kept the machine running, and as these witnesses were brought in for questioning, the dam of silence began to crack in ways the task force hadn't even dared to hope. One particular breakthrough came from a retired corporate secretary, a woman named Evelyn Marsh, who had worked in the Sterling building during the mid-'80s. She hadn't been a conspirator in the murder, but she had been the person who handled the extraordinary files, the documents that never made it into the official records, the ones that Sterling had personally insisted be kept in a secure archive that he alone could access. Evelyn had kept a meticulous, private set of notes for her own protection, a ledger of dates, times, and names that correlated with Sterling's secretive late-night meetings. She provided the task force with a key to a locker in a Greyhound station that had been sitting unopened since 1988. Inside was a treasure trove of early-stage project memos that linked Sterling directly to the land where Clara's body was rumored to have been hidden before being moved, a site that had been the subject of an intense, decades-long debate in the local investigative press. The notes proved that Sterling had personally overseen the excavation and reburial of something at that site during the heavy monsoon of '85, a task that required heavy machinery and a complete suspension of the site's official construction permit. This discovery pushed the investigation into the field, a massive, multi-agency excavation that utilized high-resolution ground-penetrating radar to scan the terrain of the old Sterling foundation sites. For weeks, the teams worked under the relentless Arizona sun, their equipment probing the earth for the anomalies that would indicate a historical disturbance of the soil. The tension at the site was palpable, the media drones hovering like vultures above the perimeter, while the families of other, long-lost individuals watched from the sidelines, their eyes filled with a mix of dread and a desperate, burning hope. The excavation wasn't just about finding Clara Sterling's original burial spot. It was about confirming the methodology of a monster. They found traces, a broken piece of jewelry, a specific type of soil-stabilizing additive that hadn't been used on the site, and a layer of earth that had been turned over and packed down with a mechanical force that defied the natural geological strata. They had found the footprint of the crime, a silent witness that had been waiting beneath the concrete for nearly 40 years. As the forensic results came back, linking the site to the materials found on Sterling's property, the legal momentum reached a point of no return. The prosecution began to build the narrative not just of a single murder, but of a pattern of calculated, sociopathic removal of threats. They brought in a panel of behavioral experts who analyzed Sterling's corporate career, his hostile takeovers, his sudden, unexplained destruction of competing firms, and the way he had consistently surrounded himself with people who were either too afraid or too compromised to ever speak out. It was a comprehensive psychological portrait of a man who viewed the world as a game of optimization, where the human beings in his path were either assets or variables to be eliminated. The courtroom strategy was no longer about the heat of the moment. It was about the cold, calculated, and long-term commitment to a life of predation. The emotional impact of these revelations on the city of Phoenix was devastating. The buildings that had defined the skyline, the ones the residents had pointed to with a sense of pride, were now being viewed through the lens of the trial. The architecture of the city had become the architecture of the crime. The public began to demand a complete audit of the city's development history, a push for a level of transparency that hadn't existed in the boom years. The trial of Arthur Sterling became the catalyst for a total, systemic reckoning, a moment where the city had to ask itself what it had traded for its growth and how it had allowed a man like Sterling to become the face of its own ambitions. The anger in the streets was not just about Clara Sterling. It was about the corruption of the civic soul, the feeling that the very ground they walked on had been purchased with a currency of violence and deceit. In the midst of all this, Sterling remained a black hole of human experience. He was a man who, during his interrogations, would speak only of the necessity of order and the importance of structural integrity in his business, completely ignoring the questions about the bodies in the ground or the lives he had destroyed. He was an empty suit, a man who had spent so long hiding his own humanity that he had lost the ability to even recognize the concept in others. He would sit for hours in the interrogation room, staring at the ceiling, his fingers tapping out a silent, steady code on the surface of the metal table, as if he were still managing his portfolio, still planning his next big acquisition, oblivious to the fact that his empire was gone and his freedom was never, ever coming back. The prosecutors, realizing that Sterling was not going to break through traditional interrogation techniques, shifted their approach. They brought in witnesses, people whose lives had been altered by his business practices, people who had suffered because of his cold, clinical disregard for the human element. They had them describe the personal, intimate details of their losses, forcing Sterling to listen to the specific, human consequences of his optimal business strategies. For the first time, the flicker of a reaction appeared in Sterling's eyes, not remorse, but a flash of confusion, a look of genuine, baffled annoyance, as if he couldn't understand why these people were talking about such inefficient, emotional variables. He didn't understand the pain. He only understood the loss of utility. As the discovery phase drew to a close, the sheer volume of the evidence began to threaten the capacity of the courthouse itself. They had thousands of hours of audio, millions of pages of documents, and a physical trail of evidence that stretched from the Phoenix foothills to the dark, hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands. The task force was working with an unprecedented level of interagency cooperation, building a case that wasn't just airtight, it was a forensic fortress. They weren't just proving a murder. They were documenting the life of a parasite. They had the emails, the wire transfers, the secret recordings, the DNA, and the buried secrets of the ground itself. They had everything except the confession, and as the trial approached, they realized that they didn't even need that anymore. They had the truth, and in the light of the modern age, the truth was an avalanche that no amount of prestige, money, or silence could ever hope to stop. The final piece of the discovery phase was the recovery of the Sterling Protocols, a digital document discovered on a long-lost server that had been used by his personal legal team to monitor the original police investigation. It was a step-by-step guide on how to corrupt a case, how to plant false leads, and how to use the media to spin the narrative, all written in a crisp, business-like tone. It was the definitive proof of the cover-up, a document that made the trial of the century not just a trial about murder, but a trial about the abuse of the law itself. It was the ultimate, final nail in the coffin of the Sterling myth, a document that proved that everything the public had suspected about the corruption of the 1980s was true, and that the man who had sat at the heart of it all had been nothing more than a small, calculated, and deeply, fundamentally broken man who had spent his life playing God with the lives of everyone else. The New York and Arizona branches of the federal investigation began to coordinate their efforts, realizing that the influence of Sterling's shadow network was not just local, but part of a larger, systemic web of influence that had spread across the nation. The Phoenix 1985 cold case was becoming the flagship of a new, aggressive era of justice, where no amount of time, prestige, or wealth could shield a monster from the reach of the law. The detectives were no longer just tracking a ghost. They were dismantling a system, and with every file they processed, every document they decoded, and every secret they exhumed, they were inching closer to a total, final, and absolute victory. The ghost of Clara Sterling was finally beginning to speak, and as her story was pieced back together in the light of the evidence, the world was finally, and definitively, learning how to listen to the truth that had been buried in the desert for so long. The case was no longer a mystery. It was a testament, a story of the persistence of the human spirit and the relentless, driving need to ensure that justice, no matter how long it takes, will always, inevitably, reach the truth. The transition from the discovery phase to the pretrial motions period felt less like a legal progression and more like the systematic dismantling of a mountain that Arthur Sterling had spent 40 years building out of fear, money, and the carefully curated myth of his own invincibility. As the defense teams filed their frantic, last-ditch efforts to suppress the Sterling protocols and the forensic evidence retrieved from the excavation sites, the prosecution, a unified front of federal attorneys and veteran cold case experts, was moving with a singular, terrifying focus. They weren't just fighting to prove that Sterling had pulled the trigger or choked the life out of Clara. They were preparing to argue that he had, in fact, been an active, ongoing criminal enterprise for the duration of his public life. The court dockets were swelling with motions, exhibits, and witness lists that read like a directory of the city's most influential and now most terrified citizens. The public's gaze, which had initially been one of mere fascination, was turning into a burning, collective demand for a total accounting, a societal purging of the rot that Sterling's success had normalized. The defense, led by a high-profile legal firm known for its ability to manufacture reasonable doubt in the most hopeless scenarios, began to adopt a strategy of systemic obsolescence. They argued that the forensic standards of 1985 were fundamentally incompatible with the digital and genetic methods used in 2026, and that the chain of custody for evidence recovered 40 years later was, by definition, compromised. It was a calculated, cold-blooded attempt to invalidate the very science that had brought their client to the threshold of a cell. But the lead prosecutor, Eleanor Vance, a woman whose entire career had been built on the cold case files of the Southwest, was ready. She brought in a team of world-class forensic anthropologists and data architects who could testify not just to the state of the evidence, but to the inevitability of its preservation, given the specific, arid, and undisturbed nature of the burial sites Sterling had chosen. She wasn't just presenting findings. She was presenting a reality that Sterling's lawyers had no way to manipulate. As the pre-trial hearings stretched into the sweltering heat of August, the courtroom became a crucible of institutional memory. The judge, a man who had himself grown up in the shadow of the Sterling skyline, presided with a stoic, ironclad neutrality that left no room for the theatrical maneuvers the defense was attempting. During one particularly heated motion, Sterling himself finally spoke, his first words on the record since the Mansion arrest. His voice, once a smooth, resonant instrument of civic command, had become thin, brittle, and edged with a desperate, frantic irritability. He complained of the injustice of the process, the harassment of his character, and the obsolescence of the charges, his tone revealing the mind of a man who still couldn't comprehend that the world he had manipulated for decades no longer bowed to his whim. It was a revealing moment, a crack in the granite, that confirmed for the observers that Sterling didn't just feel he was innocent, he felt he was beyond the reach of the law. The task force, meanwhile, was operating on a different frequency, beginning to map the Sterling diaspora, the network of individuals who had been on his payroll or in his debt and had subsequently fled or gone into deep cover once the Biltmore mansion was breached. They were tracking the flight of middle management corporate fixers, the people who had been responsible for the sanitization of his records over the years, and they found that this group was increasingly prone to betrayal. The code of silence, as the investigators called it, was failing. The prospect of facing federal conspiracy charges, coupled with the realization that Sterling had never truly cared for their survival, caused a cascade of defections. One by one, these fixers started coming forward with their own caches of evidence, internal memos, logs of untraceable payments, and recordings of conversations that had been kept as insurance policies for decades. This secondary wave of evidence was, in many ways, more damaging than the initial forensics. It documented the business of the cover-up, a detailed operational manual of how to corrupt a precinct, how to influence a jury pool, and how to use the media as a weapon of distraction. The prosecution team, in a masterstroke of strategy, began to weave this into their case, transforming the murder trial into an indictment of the corruption that had poisoned the city's institutions. The media, initially cautious about linking the murder to the broader corruption, began to publish a series of explosive reports that tied the Sterling Mansion arrests to a massive, systemic failure in local governance. It was a feedback loop. The legal evidence fed the public outcry, and the public outcry generated more leads for the investigators, creating a momentum that no defense team, no matter how expensive, could possibly halt. The defense, recognizing that their traditional tactics of obfuscation were failing, shifted to a desperate, last-minute argument of mental incompetence. They claimed that Sterling, now in his late 80s, was suffering from the early stages of cognitive decline, that he could no longer recall the events of 1985, and that a trial would be a violation of his constitutional rights. This was the final, transparent gambit, a pathetic attempt to use the frailty of age to escape the gravity of his crimes. The prosecution, anticipating this, countered with a psychiatric evaluation that had been conducted over a period of 3 months, an evaluation that showed Sterling to be cognitively sharp, deeply analytical, and completely capable of understanding the nature of the charges against him. The psychiatrist's report, which was released to the public, was a brutal, clinical demolition of the defense's claims, painting a portrait of a man who had used his age not as a shield of confusion, but as a deliberate mask of indifference. As the pretrial phase neared its end, the atmosphere in Phoenix became charged with a historical urgency. People weren't just waiting for a trial. They were waiting for a reckoning. The city was preparing for a spectacle of justice that had been delayed by 40 years, a moment when the truth would finally be given the platform it had been denied. The investigators were exhausted, their personal lives put on hold, their health pushed to the limit, but they were driven by a singular, unshakable conviction that they were not just prosecuting a man, but closing a wound that had been open for generations. They were the ones who had finally, against all odds, managed to break the silence. Inside the detention center, Sterling's isolation became complete. His legal team, frustrated by his inability to offer them anything but his own unshakable arrogance, began to distance themselves, the cracks in his defense reflecting the broader disintegration of his life. He was a man who had spent his life surrounded by people who were either too afraid or too incentivized to tell him no, and he was now discovering the absolute, crushing loneliness of a person who has never actually loved, and who has never actually been loved in return. The guards, the staff, and the other inmates, they all knew who he was, and the disdain, the open, raw contempt they held for him, was a weight that even his billionaire ego couldn't deflect. The final piece of the evidentiary puzzle was the testimony of a woman who had been a witness in 1985, a witness who had been silenced by a direct, personal threat from Sterling himself. She had lived in hiding for decades, never daring to return to Phoenix, never daring to speak the name of the man who had stolen her peace. But when she heard of the arrest, when she saw his face on the news, she came forward, not out of a desire for retribution, but out of a need to finally be free. Her testimony, which was recorded via deposition due to her fragile health, was a harrowing, visceral account of what she had seen that night in the storm. It wasn't the forensic evidence or the documents that sealed the case. It was the simple, terrifying truth of a person who had spent 40 years carrying a secret that was never hers to keep. As the hearing to set the trial date approached, the prosecution team had a moment of quiet reflection in their office, looking at the mountain of evidence that was now their reality. They knew that the road ahead would be grueling, that the trial would be a trial of attrition, and that every detail, every motion, and every witness would be contested with a level of intensity that would define their careers. But they also knew that they had something the defense would never have, the truth. And in the final accounting, in the light of the evidence they had exhumed from the desert, the truth was not just a powerful argument, it was an unstoppable, inevitable force. The ghost of Clara Sterling was no longer a mystery. She was the central, driving power behind a prosecution that was now, finally, ready to show the world that no amount of money, no level of power, and no number of years can ever hide the truth of what has been done in the dark. The courtroom in the Phoenix Federal District, once just a sterile space of legal process, was now being transformed into a place of profound historical weight. The trial of Arthur Sterling was not just a criminal proceeding, it was the final, necessary act of a city trying to reconcile with its own past. The investigators, as they walked out of the building after their final pretrial hearing, looked out at the city skyline, the buildings that Arthur Sterling had built, the skyline that had once been his own personal, corporate trophy, and for the first time, they felt that the city was finally and truly their own again. They had done the work, they had carried the weight, and they were ready for the final, concluding struggle of a cold case that had finally met its match. The mystery was gone, the truth was here, and the light was finally and absolutely on. The trial of Arthur Sterling opened not with a shout, but with the suffocating, reverent silence of a cathedral, a room packed with the ghosts of a city's forgotten history. The gallery was a collision of worlds, aging socialites from the 1980s, their faces etched with the strain of secrets finally being forced to the surface, young reporters, their eyes hungry for the truth of a decade they had only ever read about, and the families of the victims, their presence a searing indictment of the silence that had reigned for 40 years. Arthur Sterling sat at the center of it all, a man reduced to the stark dimensions of his crimes, his tailored suit hanging loosely on a frame that had once seemed larger than life. The air in the room was electric, charged with the anticipation of a reckoning that most in attendance had long ago concluded would never arrive. As the prosecution began their opening statement, a narrative began to emerge, not of a crime, but of a systematic, decades-long occupation of the city's institutions by a man who had treated justice like a line item on a balance sheet. Eleanor Vance, the lead prosecutor, stood before the jury with the calm, terrifying certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime documenting the rot. She didn't speak of the murder as an isolated event. She spoke of it as the original sin of a commercial empire. She laid out the timeline of 1985 with the cold, diagnostic precision of a surgeon, connecting the disappearance of Clara Sterling to the precise moments when Arthur Sterling's company, then a struggling regional developer, suddenly found itself flush with an inexplicable, untraceable influx of capital. It was a story of cause and effect, of a man who had traded the life of a young woman for the first foundation stone of his skyscraper city. The jury watched, captivated, as she moved through the exhibits. The grainy, enhanced footage of the Biltmore Mansion exit, the recovered pages of Clara's diary, and the chilling, internal memos from the Sterling protocols that proved the murder had been followed by a meticulously executed, multi-year plan to corrupt the local police department. The defense's rebuttal, in stark contrast, felt hollow, an attempt to build a house of cards in the middle of a hurricane. They spent the better part of the first week trying to argue the irrelevance of the archival evidence, claiming that the modern forensic techniques were speculative and that the testimony of the surviving fixers was the product of coerced memories. But their strategy crumbled the moment the prosecution brought forth the first of the physical witnesses, the retired forensic analyst who had spent her final years uncovering the lost security reel. Her testimony was a masterclass in the intersection of dedication and technology. She walked the jury through the digital process of recovery with a simplicity that made the technical impossible seem like a basic, undeniable fact. When the jury saw the footage projected onto the wall, the grainy, haunting image of Sterling leading Clara into the shadows of the monsoon-heavy night, the murmurs in the gallery died out, replaced by a collective, shuddering breath. It wasn't just evidence. It was a ghost returning to testify against the man who had tried to erase it. The middle phase of the trial shifted from the forensic to the personal, as the prosecution began to bring in the families of the victims Sterling's shadow network had allegedly pruned. One by one, they took the stand, people whose lives had been derailed by sudden, unexplained deaths, or whose careers had been destroyed by Sterling's corporate sabotage. It was a parade of lives that had been lived in the long shadow of the millionaire's success. The testimony of the woman who had been silenced by Sterling's personal threat in 1985 was the turning point. She appeared via video link, her voice thin but unwavering as she described the night of the storm, the sight of Sterling's vehicle near the ravine, and the terrifying, cold realization that her own life was at stake if she dared to tell the truth. It was a devastating, human portrait of the cost of Sterling's silence, a moment that stripped away the corporate myth of the visionary developer and replaced it with the reality of a man who ruled through the weaponization of fear. The most grueling part of the trial for the public was not the testimony of the victims, but the testimony of the fixers, the former police officers, the corporate lawyers, and the political consultants who had functioned as the nervous system of Sterling's influence. As they testified, the courtroom was forced to confront the extent to which the city's institutions had been infiltrated and compromised. They described how Sterling had used his philanthropy as a shield, how he had cultivated relationships with judges and district attorneys through a series of favors and consulting fees, and how he had used the media to feed the public a steady diet of manufactured success, while the reality of his corruption was rotting the city from within. It was a deep, historical accounting, a narrative that implicated not just Arthur Sterling, but the society that had allowed him to flourish. The courtroom became a mirror, and the people of Phoenix, watching from the gallery, were forced to look at their own city with a new, deeply skeptical eye. Midway through the proceedings, a stunning development occurred. A document cache was recovered from a long-abandoned safety deposit box in Tucson, belonging to one of Sterling's primary legal enablers who had died only months prior. The cache contained the master ledger, an accounting of every bribe, every payoff, and every instance of judicial obstruction that had taken place between 1986 and 1999. The ledger was a literal inventory of justice for sale, a document so comprehensive and so explosive that the judge ordered a 24-hour recess to allow both sides to process its implications. For the prosecution, it was the final, absolute confirmation of the conspiracy. For the defense, it was a tactical death blow. When the trial resumed, the defense's argument of reasonable doubt had been rendered entirely moot. They were no longer defending a man against a murder charge. They were defending the collapse of an entire criminalized history of local governance. Sterling, for his part, remained an unsettling, static presence throughout the proceedings. He didn't seem to be watching the evidence, didn't seem to be reacting to the testimony, and didn't seem to be listening to the arguments. He sat in his chair, a man who had become a statue of his own ego, his eyes tracking the dust motes in the courtroom light, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying detachment. It was the face of a man who had successfully convinced himself that he was the protagonist of his own personal mythology, and that the courtroom, the evidence, and the jury were simply minor, irrelevant obstacles in a narrative that would eventually swing back in his favor. It was a performance of sociopathic confidence so profound that it left the observers in the gallery wondering if he truly believed in his own innocence, or if he had simply decided, long ago, that the truth was a luxury he couldn't afford. As the final week of the trial arrived, the prosecution brought the focus back to Clara Sterling. They brought in an art historian to speak about her work, her potential, and the bright, creative future that had been stolen. They brought in her family, whose lives had been frozen in the amber of her disappearance for 40 years. They wanted the jury to look at the man in the suit and see, not the billionaire, but the person who had ended a life of beauty for the sake of an insurance policy. It was a deliberate, necessary pivot to the human element, an attempt to reclaim the story of Clara from the machinery of the legal and corporate process. The gallery, for the first time, was filled with the sound of collective weeping, a mourning that had been delayed by 4 decades and was finally being allowed to happen in the open. The closing arguments were a battle between two irreconcilable realities. The defense argued that the trial was a technological inquisition, a historical reachback that punished a man for his success using tools that didn't exist when the crime was committed. They spoke of the American dream, of the transformative power of business, and of the danger of allowing the past to dictate the present. But Eleanor Vance's closing argument was a direct, searing strike at the core of the defense's morality. Success, she said, her voice resonant and clear, is not a license to violate the fundamental rights of others. The American dream is not a shroud that you can use to hide the bodies of the people you have killed. Justice is not a luxury, and it is not an antique. It is the necessary, constant, and unyielding demand that we account for our actions, no matter how much time has passed, and no matter how much power we have managed to accumulate. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the silence that fell over the city of Phoenix was absolute. It was the silence of a community that was waiting for the final, definitive resolution of a tragedy that had defined its history. The trial had been more than a trial. It had been an exorcism, a painful, necessary extraction of the rot that had been festering in the city's foundations for years. People gathered in the parks, in the coffee shops, and in the squares, waiting for the word, the final, inevitable conclusion that would turn the page on an era. The case of Arthur Sterling was the case of Phoenix, a story of growth, a story of ambition, and a story of the high, often hidden price that is paid for a success that is built in the dark. The verdict, when it finally arrived, was a simple, stark, and absolute statement: guilty on all counts. It wasn't a roar of celebration. It was a deep, collective sigh of relief. Sterling was handcuffed, his status as a titan of industry stripped away in the span of a single, fateful minute. The cameras captured the final, desperate look on his face, the look of a man who had realized, finally, that his world was gone and that he was nothing more than a prisoner of the truth. The trial was over, the mystery was solved, and the desert of Phoenix was finally, after 40 years, ready to move on. The ghost of Clara Sterling had been brought home, her story finally and irrevocably returned to the light. The trial had been the final, necessary act, the moment the city had finally decided that the truth was the only foundation worth building on, and that the shadows, no matter how long they had reigned, were not meant to last forever. The guilty verdict against Arthur Sterling was not merely a judicial conclusion. It was a societal earthquake that leveled the landscape of Phoenix's power structure in a single, thunderous afternoon. As the bailiffs led the former titan of industry out of the courtroom, the camera flashes were blinding, not merely to capture the image of a fallen man, but to illuminate the wreckage of a 21st-century city that had been built upon the blueprints of a 1985 murder. The courtroom, once a place of sterile legal procedure, had been transformed into a site of profound historical exorcism. Outside, the streets of downtown Phoenix were eerily silent. The usual hum of the city had stalled, replaced by a collective, palpable sense of vertigo. For decades, the Sterling skyline had been the horizon line of Phoenix. Now, as the architect of that skyline was processed into the system, the city itself felt as if it were untethering from its own identity. The immediate aftermath was a scramble for systemic survival. Corporate boards, political committees, and charitable foundations, all once the beneficiaries of Sterling's generosity, went into full-blown panic. The master ledger, that explosive inventory of bribery and systemic corruption that had been the prosecution's ace in the hole, was now being scrutinized by a secondary task force of independent monitors. They were looking for the nodes of the shadow network that still remained active. It was a digital and financial forensics sweep of unprecedented scale. Names that had been considered pillars of the Southwest were appearing in the ledger, their reputations dissolving in the cold, binary light of spreadsheet analysis. The realization set in. The Sterling contagion had been pervasive. It wasn't just one man. It was a culture, a deep-seated institutional rot that had been normalized through the sheer force of his wealth and the strategic application of his protocol system. Sterling himself was transferred to a high-security state facility, a far cry from the marble-floored opulence of his Biltmore mansion. The transition from billionaire to inmate was, by all accounts, as brutal as it was swift. He was stripped of the symbols of his status, subjected to the same routine as any other prisoner, and placed in a unit where his former wealth meant absolutely nothing. Those who observed him in the initial days noted a chilling, detached calm. He did not appeal for mercy. He did not rant against the system. He remained, as he had been in the courtroom, a void. It was as if, having lost his ability to manipulate the variables of his external environment, he had simply ceased to interact with the world at all. He was a man who had built a reality out of lies, and now that the house of cards had been leveled, he had no foundation left on which to exist. In the wake of the trial, the Clara Sterling Legacy Project was launched, not as a memorial to her death, but as a vehicle for the systematic audit of the city's civic history. The foundation, funded by the final, liquidated assets of the Sterling estate, tasked itself with an ambitious and perhaps impossible mandate to document every instance of municipal corruption that occurred during the Sterling years. They established a public access digital archive where citizens could submit records, documents, and testimonies related to the era. It was a project of radical, grassroots transparency, an attempt to empower the public to reclaim their own history from the sanitized, corporate-approved version that had been fed to them for 40 years. The archive became a living, breathing testament to the city's resilience, a way to ensure that the ghost of the 1985 cold case would never again be permitted to haunt the halls of local governance. However, the ripple effects of the conviction reached far beyond the boundaries of Arizona. The Sterling precedent, a new, sweeping approach to the prosecution of long-term white-collar crime, began to echo through legal halls in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Prosecutors elsewhere began to wonder how many other Sterlings were currently hiding in plain sight, their own empires built on foundations of forgotten, cold case crimes. The Phoenix case had provided a roadmap for how to weaponize the intersection of forensic science, archival research, and aggressive, non-traditional investigative techniques. It was a victory for the concept that time is not a shield for the guilty, and that the modern age of digital data and advanced forensics had effectively ended the era of the untraceable criminal. The law had finally caught up to the pace of the technology, and the predators who had thrived in the shadows were suddenly finding that there were fewer shadows left in which to hide. The family of Clara Sterling, who had spent decades living with the hollow, unanswered question of her disappearance, found themselves in a strange, new reality. They were no longer the bereaved survivors of a cold case. They were the central figures in a national dialogue about justice and accountability. Their public appearance at the final sentencing hearing was one of the most powerful moments in the city's history. They spoke not of vengeance, but of the dignity of the truth, the right of a person to be remembered for their life, not just for the way they were stolen from it. They had carried the weight of the mystery for 40 years, and in the aftermath of the trial, they finally, and for the first time, looked like they were finally able to set that weight down. The closure they had sought was not found in the guilty verdict alone. It was found in the public, communal acknowledgement that Clara had mattered. As the months of late 2027 turned toward the new year, the mansion at Biltmore began to undergo its own final transformation. The city council voted to condemn the property, citing its history as a site of systemic criminal activity. There were plans to raise the structure, to return the land to the desert, and to establish a park, a space of silence and reflection, a place where the memory of the past could be balanced by the promise of the future. The physical demolition of the mansion, which was broadcast live, was an event of immense catharsis for the city. As the wrecking balls swung into the walls of the study, the library, and the master bedroom, the very rooms where Sterling had orchestrated his deceptions and held his secrets, the audience watching felt the tangible release of a long, cold tension. It was the physical erasure of a monument to impunity, a way to show that even the most reinforced, opulent structures of power could be brought down to earth. The detectives of the task force, for their part, began the process of reintegration. They had been defined by the Sterling case for years, and now they were tasked with the challenge of moving on. Some returned to their departments, some moved into the private sector, and others dedicated themselves to the new Cold Case Forensic Initiative, a permanent national unit that would serve as the successor to the Thorne Sterling investigations. They had become the architects of a new standard of investigation, a group of people who knew exactly what happens when you decide that the truth is worth every sacrifice. They were the ones who had chased the ghost to the end, and they knew, better than anyone, that the ghost was never truly a supernatural entity. It was just a man with a secret and a society that had chosen to look away. The sociological impact on the youth of Phoenix was perhaps the most enduring legacy of the trial. A new generation of students, journalists, and civic leaders was rising, an entire cohort who had grown up watching the dismantling of the Sterling myth. They were a generation that held a deep, profound skepticism toward the too-big-to-fail narrative, a generation that was fundamentally committed to the principle that transparency is the most critical component of a functional society. They were the new guardians of the city, and they had been baptized in the fire of the 1985 cold case. They knew the history, they knew the cost of the silence, and they were, in every sense, the generation that would ensure that the darkness of the Sterling era was never allowed to repeat itself. As the year closed, the archives were finalized and the case file was formally retired. The Phoenix 1985 cold case had officially passed from the present tense into the realm of history. It was no longer a matter of active investigation. It was a matter of record, a definitive document of a tragedy, a crime, a cover-up, and a resolution. The city of Phoenix continued to grow, the buildings continued to rise, and the desert continued to shift, but the shadow, the persistent, haunting, 40-year-old shadow, was finally gone. The case had served as the ultimate, definitive test of a society's commitment to its own values, a test that Phoenix had finally and unequivocally passed. The final entry in the Sterling file was written by the lead prosecutor, Eleanor Vance, on the final day of her tenure as the head of the task force. She wrote of the nature of the truth, of the way it survives the passage of time, and of the way that, eventually, every lie must confront the reality of its own insufficiency. She wrote that the case was not about the capture of a man, but about the reclamation of the city. She concluded that the mystery of Clara Sterling was solved, but the work of justice, the work of maintaining the light, the work of ensuring that no man could ever again treat a community as his own personal playground, that work was the true, unending purpose of the law. The ghost had been laid to rest, the mystery was at an end, and for the first time in nearly half a century, the city could finally look at its skyline and see not a monument to a predator, but the reflection of a community that had finally and definitively chosen to be its own, honest self. The sentencing of Arthur Sterling to the stark, windowless confines of the state's most secure federal facility was not merely a conclusion. It was the final, definitive period at the end of a long, erratic, and deeply scarred sentence written in the history of Phoenix. By the autumn of 2027, the city had begun to physically shed the skin of the Sterling era. The demolition of the Biltmore estate had been completed, and the land, once the center of a shadow network that had directed the city's growth, was now being converted into a public commons, an open, accessible green space designed to be the literal antithesis of the fortress-like secrecy Sterling had cultivated for 40 years. Yet the task force found that the most complex work was only just beginning. They were transitioning from the high-octane environment of the courtroom to the grueling, meticulous work of institutional decontamination. The Sterling contagion, as the media had dubbed it, had infected the municipal zoning board, the local architectural permitting office, and even the pension funds of the city's civil servants. The detectives, now acting as the nation's foremost experts in municipal corruption, were tasked with auditing the very skeleton of the city. This process of institutional reclamation was, in many ways, more dangerous than the investigation of the murder itself. As the task force began to flag the questionable land use permits and the backroom agreements that had allowed Sterling to bypass environmental and zoning regulations for decades, they were met with a wall of litigation that threatened to bankrupt the city's ability to function. The legal heirs to Sterling's corporate empire, a group of shell entities operated by a cabal of anonymous investors, argued that the city was attempting a totalitarian takeover of private property. It was a cynical, desperate move to prevent the audit from reaching the level of the municipal leadership. But the task force, supported by the momentum of the trial's success, did not flinch. They released the second volume of the Sterling Protocols, the internal manual of corruption, which proved that the bribery was not an occasional irregularity, but a standard operating procedure for the city's largest development projects. The release of these documents was the final, devastating blow to the shadow network's influence. As the months of 2028 arrived, the focus shifted from the legal battle to the social and psychological healing of the community. The Clara Sterling Truth Centers, which had started as a localized initiative by the victim's family, were now receiving federal funding to serve as a national model for how to resolve long-term, systemic cold cases. These centers had evolved into sophisticated, multidisciplinary hubs where survivors of corporate violence and systemic corruption could find legal, forensic, and psychological support. They were a revolutionary concept, a space where the truth was not just a tool for conviction, but a vehicle for community restoration. The story of Clara Sterling had become a symbol for a generation of people who had felt powerless in the face of the too-big-to-fail corporate juggernauts. They were no longer victims of an unsolvable mystery. They were the vanguard of a new movement that insisted on the transparency of the powerful. The psychological impact on the former Sterling loyalists, the lawyers, the fixers, and the mid-level corporate functionaries who had once been the beneficiaries of his empire, was a story of quiet, disintegrating desperation. Many of these individuals, once prominent socialites who had spent their lives curating a lifestyle built on the silence of the 1985 investigation, found themselves in a state of terminal isolation. They were pariahs in their own city, their names and faces forever linked to the master ledger of bribes and obstruction. The social world of Phoenix had undergone a radical, painful reorganization. The high society galas of the past were replaced by town hall meetings, forensic audits, and community-led reviews of the city's development goals. The era of the untouchable millionaire had effectively been legislated out of existence, replaced by a system of checks and balances that were designed specifically to prevent another Arthur Sterling from rising through the cracks of the city's ambition. Meanwhile, the investigation into this Sterling diaspora, the individuals who had fled the city when the mansion was breached, continued to bear fruit. The federal task force, utilizing the digital trails uncovered in the Swiss server arrays from the previous year, managed to track down the former head of Sterling's corporate security, a man who had been hiding in a remote village in the Andes under a false identity for over 2 decades. His return to the United States and his subsequent, tearful confession provided the final pieces of the puzzle regarding the handling of Clara Sterling's remains. He detailed the, at times comical, at times deeply horrific, lengths to which Sterling had gone to ensure that the site of the original murder could never be tied back to him. It was the testimony of a man who had been haunted by his own silence for 20 years, a man who had lived in fear that the ghost of the girl would finally find him. His return, and the closure he provided, was the final, necessary act of the legal narrative. The detectives, now nearing the end of their task force mandate, reflected on the profound transformation they had witnessed. They had started the investigation expecting to find a singular, sadistic killer, but they ended it by uncovering a system of institutional predation that had effectively turned the city into a hostage. They had learned that the most dangerous criminals are not the ones who operate in the dark, but the ones who operate in the bright, public light, hidden by the shield of their own success. They had learned that the truth is a weapon, and that if you wield it with enough precision, enough persistence, and enough cold, forensic focus, it can dismantle even the most entrenched of systems. They were the architects of a new standard of investigation, a team that had fundamentally changed the way the United States defines cold case justice. As the summer of 2028 approached, the park that had replaced the Biltmore estate finally opened to the public. It was a beautiful, expansive space with walking trails, public art, and a small, quiet memorial to Clara Sterling. The city had decided that the park would not be named after the estate or the mansion or the man who had owned it. It was to be known as Resolution Commons, a place for the people of Phoenix to gather, to think, and to remember that the city had finally found its own, honest identity. The memorial, a simple bronze sculpture of an artist's easel, stood as a constant reminder that the truth is the most important element of any community's foundation. The mystery had been solved, the killer had been jailed, and the city, finally free of the shadow of 1985, could finally look toward its own future without the weight of a ghost hanging over its skyline. The final piece of the archival record was the public release of the full and censored Sterling ledger. It was a massive, data-rich document that was made available to every citizen, a resource that would be studied, debated, and analyzed by historians for decades. It was the ultimate, final act of transparency, the moment the city decided that it would no longer keep its own dirty secrets. The ledger served as a living, public textbook of the systemic corruption that had nearly destroyed the city, a permanent reference point for anyone who dared to ask where the power actually resided. The Thorne Sterling era was officially over, and the era of the open city had begun. The members of the task force, as they packed up their files and closed the final, encrypted drives of the investigation, felt a sense of profound, weary accomplishment. They had done the work, they had carried the weight, and they had finally brought the truth back to the light. They knew that their victory wasn't just in the prison cell that now held Arthur Sterling. It was in the resilience of the city that had managed to survive his influence. They had seen the worst of humanity, they had navigated the deepest shadows of the human condition, and they had emerged with their integrity intact. They were the guardians of a truth that had been buried for 40 years, and they were, in every way, the heroes of a story that would define the era. The Phoenix 1985 cold case was finally, and for the last time, a closed, settled, and resolved history. The mystery was gone, the truth was established, and the ghost that had haunted the Biltmore estates, the ghost of the young artist who had loved the truth more than her own safety, was finally at peace. As the sunlight played over the new, open spaces of Resolution Commons, it wasn't hard to see that the city had changed. It was a city of light, a city of truth, and a city that had finally learned that no amount of money, no level of power, and no number of years could ever hide the truth of what has been done in the dark. The ghost was caught, the mystery was solved, and the light was now, and forever, the standard by which all shadows would be measured. The case was over, but the work, the slow, steady, daily work of building a transparent, accountable, and human-centered world was the true and final legacy of the case that had gripped a nation for over a quarter of a century. The phoenix of the desert had finally risen, not from the ash of its ambition, but from the clear, unyielding power of the truth. The conviction of Arthur Sterling and the subsequent administrative collapse of the Phoenix Shadow Network were seismic events, but as the final months of 2026 bled into the promise of 2027, the investigative focus shifted toward the long-term structural integrity of the city. The Thorne Division of the FBI, having effectively transitioned into the primary oversight body for the post-Sterling reconstruction, began the monumental task of auditing the city's entire post-1985 development portfolio. They were no longer just detectives. They were the forensic cartographers of a city that had been designed by a criminal mind. Every zoning ordinance, every tax increment financing district, and every municipal contract that bore the fingerprint of the Sterling era was being scrutinized for hidden vulnerabilities. It was a process of total, systemic de-escalation, where the goal was to ensure that the Sterling contagion, a business model rooted in the exploitation of legal ambiguity and systemic corruption, could never again gain a foothold in the desert. The scale of this forensic audit was almost impossible to comprehend. The task force had to process millions of documents, physical and digital, that had been buried in the archives of the city's planning department, the county recorder's office, and the hidden private servers of Sterling's defunct holding companies. They discovered that Sterling hadn't just been a developer, he had been a secret, shadow governance architect. He had effectively written the rules of the city's expansion, ensuring that every road, every residential community, and every commercial hub he developed was positioned to maximize his control over the city's infrastructure. The audit revealed that he had even manipulated the city's water rights, a matter of life and death importance in the Arizona desert, to ensure that his own properties would always be the last to be restricted during the inevitable cycles of drought. It was a level of, quite literal, parasitic control that left the new municipal leadership reeling. This revelation triggered a massive, citywide movement for civic restoration. The public, finally realizing the extent to which their own daily lives had been manipulated by the criminal machinations of a single man, began demanding a total, radical restructuring of the city's governance. This Sterling audit became the central platform of the municipal elections in 2027, a campaign that wasn't about the economy or the infrastructure, but about the integrity of the city itself. For the first time in the history of Phoenix, the citizens were being asked to decide not what they wanted the city to be, but what they were willing to sacrifice to ensure that it was theirs. It was a profound, democratic awakening, a rejection of the top-down model of corporate urbanism that Sterling had perfected, and a move toward a new, transparent, and participatory system of civic design. Meanwhile, the psychological impact of the audit on the survivors of the Sterling era began to take a more focused, community-driven shape. The Clara Sterling Truth Centers, now serving as the primary clearinghouse for victim advocacy, expanded their reach to provide direct support for individuals who had lost their homes, their businesses, or their livelihoods due to Sterling's predatory land use tactics. The centers were documenting the displaced, the hundreds, perhaps thousands, of families who had been forced out of their homes in the late 80s and early 90s to make room for Sterling's grand designs. The documentation process was not just a legal effort, it was a way to restore the dignity of these individuals, to acknowledge that their losses were not merely business casualties, but the direct result of a calculated, criminal campaign. The legal teams representing the shell corporations that were the final remnants of Sterling's empire were becoming increasingly irrelevant, their efforts to block the audit meeting with total, uncompromising resistance from the new municipal government. The city had retained a team of high-powered, pro-transparency law firms specifically to dismantle these entities, and they were using every weapon at their disposal: bankruptcy proceedings, civil litigation, and the sheer weight of the federal forensic evidence. The shell companies were collapsing, their assets being reclaimed by the city and the victims' advocacy groups, creating a cycle of restorative justice that was both unprecedented and deeply necessary. The very machinery that had been used to build the Sterling myth was now being used to dismantle it, brick by brick, cent by cent. As the audit progressed, the task force discovered a series of contingency files hidden in a deep storage facility in Scottsdale, files that hadn't been part of the original mansion discovery. These were files that Sterling had kept on his own associates, his own legal counsel, and the local officials he had been paying off for decades. It was a master file of blackmail, a digital and physical record of the deepest, darkest secrets of the city's elite. The existence of this file was the ultimate, final leverage against the old guard of Phoenix. The federal agents, with the support of the new municipal leadership, began to use these files to force the resignation of those officials who had been complicit in the Sterling era. It was a quiet, clean, and efficient purge. No public trials were needed, just the quiet, devastating truth presented in private meetings. This process of purge, while not without its controversies, was the catalyst that finally enabled the city to move on. The old guard, the people who had been the face of the Phoenix establishment for decades, were systematically removed from their positions, their influence neutralized by the very blackmail files Sterling had created to keep them in line. It was a poetic and deeply satisfying justice. The city was undergoing a total, generational change in leadership, a transition that was being overseen by the very people who had once been on the outside looking in. The spirit of Phoenix was changing, shifting from a culture of secrecy and ambition to a culture of transparency and accountability. The ghost of Clara Sterling, once the silent witness to the city's corruption, had become the guiding light of this new civic reality. Her name was now synonymous with the demand for a fair, transparent, and human-centric urban design. The Clara Sterling Memorial Scholarship, the Truth Centers, and the ongoing audit were all part of a larger, unified effort to ensure that the city never again lost its moral compass. The tragedy of her death had been turned into the bedrock of a new, better version of the city. Her memory was no longer a ghost of the past. It was the blueprint for the future. The city had finally learned that the most important thing you can build is not a skyscraper, but a society that is worthy of the people who live in it. Inside the federal supermax, Arthur Sterling was becoming an increasingly forgotten man. He had no visitors, no communication with the outside world, and no interest from the people who had once hung on his every word. He was a man who had staked his entire existence on the power of his influence, and he was now living in a reality where he had absolutely none. He was the ultimate historical void. The world outside, the world of the light, the world of transparency, the world of truth, it was all moving on without him. He was a man who had dared to play God with the city of Phoenix, and he was now a prisoner of a reality that had written him out of the story completely. In the final, quiet days of the investigative phase, the task force discovered one last document in the Scottsdale storage facility. It wasn't a crime file, a financial record, or a list of blackmail targets. It was a series of handwritten notes, written on the back of a corporate memo in 1985, just days after the murder of Clara Sterling. They were scribbled, frantic, and barely legible, detailing the fear of the future, the fear that one day, no matter how clever he was, no matter how many files he deleted, the system would finally catch up to him. He had known, even then, that the path he was on was a path toward a total, inevitable collapse. He had chosen it anyway, fueled by an ego that was larger than his fear. The document was a testament to the fact that he hadn't been an unstoppable mastermind. He had been a terrified, small-minded man who had been running from his own reflection for half a century. This was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't the brilliance of a strategy that made him dangerous. It was the depth of his fear. And it was that very fear that had made him so easy to dismantle. The moment the task force had started applying pressure, the moment they had started revealing the truth, the whole system had buckled under its own weight. The truth hadn't just defeated him. It had turned his own fear against him, causing his empire of lies to disintegrate the moment it was exposed to the light. The lesson for the future was clear. Predators like Arthur Sterling are only as strong as the shadows they hide in. Once you bring them into the light, Once you show them for what they really are, they are nothing. They are just small, terrified men who have spent their lives running from the one thing they can never outrun: themselves. The Phoenix 1985 cold case was finally and definitively closed. The files were archived, the evidence was stored, and the team that had cracked the mystery was beginning to move on to the next set of challenges, the next set of shadows, the next set of truths waiting to be found. The story was a testament to the idea that no matter how much technology changes, no matter how fast the world moves, and no matter how deep the burial, the truth will always, eventually, find its way to the surface. It was a story of a world that had finally learned how to be awake, a world that was finally ready to face the truth, and a world that was finally and irrevocably beginning to build the light that would make sure no other ghost would ever be able to hide in the corners of their society again. The ghost of Clara Sterling was no longer a mystery. She was the architect of a new, transparent world, and the light that she had finally brought to the truth would never, ever be extinguished. As the sweltering heat of the Arizona summer gave way to the crisp, clear nights of late 2028, the narrative of the Phoenix 1985 cold case underwent a final, profound metamorphosis. It had ceased to be a story of a single murder, a corporate empire, or even a city's corruption. It had become a global cautionary tale about the intersection of human ego and the inevitability of the digital, forensic age. The Thorne Sterling investigation, as it was now officially classified in the archives of the Department of Justice, was being studied by legal scholars, sociologists, and urban planners worldwide. It was the definitive proof that even the most well-constructed lie, if sustained for long enough, eventually creates its own gravity, pulling its architect into a final, unavoidable collapse. The city of Phoenix, having spent 2 years in the crucible of the audit and the subsequent civic purging, was emerging as a new kind of urban entity, a city that had faced its own reflection, acknowledged its flaws, and taken the radical, painful steps required to build a foundation on the bedrock of transparency. This civic restoration movement, which had begun as a localized response to the Biltmore Mansion revelations, had scaled up into a comprehensive, national reform agenda. The Clara Sterling Act, a legislative package that was currently moving through the state and federal houses, sought to redefine the responsibilities of large-scale developers, requiring public disclosure of all financial interests and a mandatory, independent audit of every land use permit issued by municipal governments. It was a direct, legislative response to the Sterling Protocols, the very rules he had used to hollow out the city's governance from the inside. The ghost of Clara Sterling, the young artist whose death had been the starting point of the 1985 mystery, was now the guiding spirit behind this wave of reform, a reminder that the cost of silence is a debt that society eventually pays with interest. Meanwhile, the internal investigation within the Phoenix Police Department, a process that had been running parallel to the Federal Task Force's audit, concluded with the release of a massive, 700-page report detailing the institutional failure of the mid-'80s. The report was an unsparing document of accountability, naming names, detailing the exact mechanisms of the corruption, and, most importantly, acknowledging the pain of the families who had been ignored, gaslit, and abandoned by the system that was supposed to protect them. The police department, under new, reformed leadership, held a public apology ceremony at the site of the new Resolution Commons. It was a deeply emotional event, a moment where the institution of the law finally and clearly acknowledged its own history of failing the very people it was created to serve. The act of apology, while not reversing the tragedies of the past, was a necessary, healing bridge, a way for the city to move forward with a shared understanding of what had gone wrong. The forensic teams, having completed their work on the city's skeleton, began the process of decommissioning the war room. The massive, data-saturated facility, which had been the nervous system of the investigation, was being emptied out, its hard drives scrubbed and archived, its charts and timelines dismantled. For the detectives who had lived in that room for the better part of 3 years, it was a moment of profound, quiet transition. They had been defined by the Sterling case, the sleepless nights, the endless loops of data, the visceral, gut-wrenching discoveries, and now, they were tasked with the challenge of finding who they were in the absence of the mystery. They weren't just detectives anymore. They were the guardians of a standard, a group of people who had fundamentally altered the way that history, crime, and justice were understood in the modern era. They had done the work, and they were ready for the rest. Back in the federal supermax, the isolation of Arthur Sterling had reached a point of absolute psychological stillness. He had ceased to be a subject of curiosity for the prison's psychiatric staff. He was simply a man who was existing in the static of his own making. The irony of his situation, the man who had built a city, a culture, and a system based on constant, hyperkinetic movement and growth, now reduced to a life of utter, sedentary, and silent confinement, was not lost on the guards. He had spent his life running from the past, only to find that the past had been the only thing that was truly waiting for him all along. He was a man who had staked his entire existence on the power of his voice and the weight of his name, and he had been reduced to a man who possessed absolutely none of those things. He was, in the end, the ultimate hollow vessel, a man who had spent his life chasing the reflection of a god, only to find that he was nothing more than a small, frightened man hiding in the dark. The technological infrastructure that had been used to take Sterling down was now being adapted to provide the world with a new, robust system of truth integrity. The FBI was partnering with international institutions to build a global ledger of trust tokens, a system that would allow individuals to verify the legitimacy of the digital entities and corporate platforms they engaged with. It was an effort to restore the fundamental element of human life, trust. The investigation into Sterling had shown how fragile trust was and how easily it could be destroyed by a single, well-placed lie. This new system was an attempt to make the truth as visible, as verifiable, and as accessible as the lies had once been. It was the final, and perhaps the most important, piece of the Sterling legacy, the creation of a world where the ghost could never again hide behind a computer screen. As the months of late 2028 passed, the memory of Arthur Sterling began to fade from the front pages, but his influence remained embedded in the very structure of the society that had finally caught him. The Phoenix 1985 cold case was no longer a story that needed to be told on the nightly news. It was a story that had been integrated into the cultural DNA of the country. It was a story that would be whispered in business schools, debated in law faculties, and retold in the living rooms of families who had found their own, small, personal justice in the wake of the national reckoning. The case was a milestone, a marker, and a turning point. It was the moment that the country had decided that no matter how complex, how wealthy, or how digital the world became, the truth would always be the ultimate and only judge. The detectives of the task force were beginning to transition as the massive, decade-long audit of the Swiss vault finally came to a successful conclusion. They were the guardians of a new, transparent world. A group of people who had spent their lives in the darkest places of the human condition and who had emerged with a profound, unshakable faith in the power of the light. They weren't just detectives. They were the historians of our own moral progress. They had learned that the shadows are not just where the monsters hide, they are where we hide the parts of ourselves we are too afraid to face. The investigation had forced the entire nation to face their own shadows, and in doing so, it had made them stronger, more resilient, and more awake. As the year 2028 reached its final, quiet days, the memorial for Clara Sterling was finally unveiled in the center of the Phoenix Park that had been built on the site of Sterling's estate. It wasn't a grandiose statue. It was a simple, elegant structure made of light-refracting glass, a monument that changed its appearance depending on the angle of the sun, reflecting the changing nature of the truth. It was a place for people to sit, to reflect, and to remember that the mystery had been solved, the killer had been caught, and the ghost that had haunted the community for 43 years had finally been returned to the past. The Phoenix 1985 cold case was no longer a story of a mystery. It was a story of the light that follows the long, cold night. The work was done. The mystery was at an end, and for the first time in nearly half a century, the Phoenix suburbs and the entire nation could finally and truly breathe in the light. The ghost was gone, and the truth, radiant and unyielding, was here to stay. In the final, overarching view, the legacy of the Phoenix investigation is found in the simple, irreducible truth that humanity's progress is not measured by the height of our buildings, the reach of our networks, or the speed of our commerce, but by the integrity of our memory. We are only as strong as the truths we are willing to face, and the only way to keep the monsters at bay is to never, ever stop shining the light into the corners where they hide. The Phoenix 1985 cold case was the moment the world decided that the truth is not a variable to be managed, but a constant to be protected. The ghost of the desert is at rest, and the light that we have lit, the light of transparency, of accountability, and of memory, is a light that will never, ever be extinguished. It is the light by which we will build the next city, the next society, and the next, more honest future. The mystery is over. The truth is told, and the long, cold night has finally and irrevocably reached its brilliant, undeniable end. The finality of the Thorne Sterling Task Force's success in the summer of 2028 felt less like a celebration and more like the collective, ragged exhale of a city that had been holding its breath for 43 years. The glass monument in the new public commons, a structure designed to refract the brutal Arizona sun into a spectrum of shifting, honest light, became the ultimate symbol of the case's resolution. It was a tangible pivot from the dark, impenetrable opacity of Arthur Sterling's world to a reality defined by radical transparency. However, as the final archival processes of the Sterling records reached their completion, the investigators and the civic leaders tasked with the city's reconstruction began to grapple with a haunting, philosophical realization. The capture of Arthur Sterling was not the elimination of a biological anomaly, but the closing of a door on an era of structural impunity that had allowed him to thrive. The question that remained, hanging in the air of every legal forum and academic debate in the nation, was not, how did we catch him? But what does it say about us that he was able to hide in plain sight for so long? The sociological autopsy of Arthur Sterling continued to yield discomforting truths about the intersection of societal indifference, urban expansion, and criminal brilliance. The investigation had unearthed that during his decades of dominance, Sterling had moved through the city's institutions like a phantom, leaving behind a trail of damaged lives and silenced voices that were dismissed as the inevitable frictions of progress. He was the ultimate master of the benign predator archetype, a man whose charisma was so effective and whose public image of the visionary builder was so carefully cultivated that it acted as a physical barrier to any form of meaningful investigation. People didn't just trust him because they were naive. They trusted him because he reflected their own aspirations of growth, wealth, and modernity back at them. He was the embodiment of the very ideals that the city claimed to value, and because he represented those values so perfectly, he was shielded from the scrutiny that would have exposed the rot beneath his foundation. This realization led to a fundamental, nationwide restructuring of the Municipal Trust Index, a system that moved beyond mere financial oversight into an empathy-based, human-centric diagnostic model. The developers at the Clara Sterling Truth Centers realized that the problem wasn't just the lack of verification, it was the total erosion of human connection in the corporate-urban environment. Sterling had been able to hide because he had been able to navigate a world where social capital was bought and sold, but human empathy was increasingly rare. The new trust protocols were designed to prioritize communal feedback, victim-led audits, and human-centric transparency over data-driven metrics. They were attempting to build a social infrastructure where a Sterling-type figure couldn't just buy their way into a community. They would have to be part of one. It was an ambitious, radical attempt to rewire the social fabric of the entire regional development sector, a project that was, in many ways, the final, most significant component of the case's resolution. As the months of late 2028 arrived, the federal court system began to see a massive, unprecedented wave of legacy cold cases being resolved across the American Southwest as the tools, the forensic techniques, and the renewed public focus sparked by the Phoenix case were applied to other, equally stubborn mysteries. The Phoenix 1985 cold case had set a new, high-water mark for what was possible when the resources of the state and the resolve of the public were finally and fully aligned. Thousands of families across the country, families who had long ago given up on the possibility of justice, were suddenly seeing their own stories being brought back into the light. It was as if a massive, hidden river of truth had finally been allowed to flow, sweeping away the sediment of decades of apathy. The Phoenix case had not just solved a murder, it had triggered a national awakening to the power of persistent, unyielding investigation. The task force members, many of whom had given a decade of their lives to the Sterling investigation, began the process of decommissioning the division. It was a bittersweet transition. They had been defined by the shadows they had chased, and now that the shadows were gone, they had to figure out who they were in the light. They weren't just detectives anymore. They were the guardians of a standard, the pioneers of a new way of seeking justice. They held a final, private ceremony at the glass monument in the park, a moment of silence for Clara Sterling and the other victims whose names were now etched into the base of the structure. It was not a moment of triumph, but a moment of acknowledgement. They had finally fulfilled the promise they had made to the victims, that they would never, ever be forgotten, and that the truth of their lives would finally be the ultimate and final legacy of the case that had consumed the city for nearly half a century. Back in the federal supermax, Arthur Sterling, the man who had once been the master of his own reality, was becoming a complete, historical irrelevance. The world had moved on. The city had been fundamentally transformed. The legal system had been fortified, and the society he had once tried to manipulate was now, finally, watching the shadows. He was a man who had lost everything, not just his wealth and his power, but his relevance. The final contingency file, the blackmail caches, and the corporate secrets, they were all now part of the public archive, the currency of his evil now being used to fund the growth of transparency. He had tried to burn the world down on his way out, and instead, he had provided the fuel for the light that would forever expose him. The story of the Phoenix 1985 cold case had concluded as the definitive, foundational narrative of the modern age of transparency. It was the story of a man who had tried to build a life in the dark, and a world that had finally, and irrevocably, learned how to use the light to find him. It was a story of a woman, Clara Sterling, whose pursuit of the truth had been interrupted by a monster, but who had, in the end, been the one to reveal the monster to the world. Her voice, long silenced, had finally been restored, her truth finally established, and her legacy secured as the catalyst for a city that was now, finally and truly, awake. The investigators, as they walked away from the park for the final time, knew that the mystery was over, but the work, the slow, steady, daily work of maintaining the light, was the true and final legacy of the case that had gripped a nation. They had found the truth, they had solved the mystery, and they had finally brought the ghost of the Biltmore back from the shadows. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the glass monument in the park continued to catch the dying rays of the light, refracting them into a myriad of directions, a reminder that the truth is rarely a single, solid line, but a complex, multifaceted thing that is always changing, always evolving, and always, inevitably, revealing the path ahead. The Phoenix 1985 cold case was no longer a mystery, it was a testament. It was a testament to the idea that no matter how deep the shadows, the light, eventually, will always find its way home. The archives of the Sterling investigation, now sealed in the National Library, would remain as a permanent, cautionary monument for future generations. They contained the blueprints of his deception, the records of his crimes, and the evidence of his ultimate, absolute failure. It was the complete, documented history of a predator who had thought he was a ghost, and who had been proven to be nothing more than a small, fragile, and utterly transparent man. The mystery was at an end, the cold case was forever resolved, and the truth, radiant, unyielding, and forever persistent, stood as the final, absolute victor in the long, dark struggle against the ghost of the past. The light was here to stay, and the shadows of 1985 had finally, and for the last time, been dissolved into the brilliant, unforgiving clarity of the present. The legacy of Clara Sterling, of the detectives who had chased the ghost for 43 years, and of the society that had finally chosen to face its own reflection, would continue to resonate long after the final page of the Sterling archives was turned. It was a story that had been written in the quiet corners of an art studio, played out on the global stage of urban expansion, and resolved in the sterile, soundless room of a federal supermax. It was a story that reminded us all of the fundamental truth, that we are only as strong as the truths we are willing to face, and that the only way to keep the monsters at bay is to never, ever stop shining the light into the corners where they hide. The ghost was caught, the truth was told, and the long, cold night of the Phoenix mystery had finally and forever reached its brilliant, undeniable end. The city had finally emerged from the desert of its own deception, and the light that was left behind was the only monument that mattered. The resolution of the Phoenix 1985 case, the culmination of nearly half a century of silence, systemic corruption, and the slow, grinding machinery of justice, stands as more than just a historical footnote. It is, in the final analysis, a testament to the fundamental, irrepressible resilience of the truth. Arthur Sterling, the man who had woven himself into the very fabric of the desert city, had bet his entire existence on the assumption that reality was malleable, that the past could be edited, and that a sufficiently powerful man could manufacture his own version of history. He spent 43 years operating on the arrogance of a builder who thought he could construct a life that was immune to the weathering effects of conscience. He was wrong. The investigation that eventually brought him down was not just a police success. It was a societal reclamation, a process of taking back the narrative from a man who had sought to own the very ground upon which the citizens of Phoenix stood. The deeper we look into the mechanics of this case, the more we realize that the most dangerous weapon Sterling possessed was not his wealth, but his ability to manufacture the acceptable. He had turned the city into a stage set, where the skyline, the public parks, and the civic discourse were all carefully managed to keep the focus on his achievements while the darker, more foundational rot was quietly buried. The detective work that dismantled this illusion was, in every sense, a process of archaeological excavation. They had to dig through layers of corporate policy, legal obfuscation, and public relations polish, piece by piece, until they reached the raw, unadorned fact of Clara Sterling's death. This wasn't just finding a body. It was uncovering the truth of how a city had permitted a monster to walk in broad daylight for decades. The detectives who led this charge were, in their own quiet way, the true architects of the new Phoenix, as they had effectively cleared the site, removed the debris, and allowed the community to see the foundation as it truly was. As we reflect on the legacy of this case, we must consider the families, the real, human centers of the tragedy who were forced to live in the shadow of Sterling's impunity for the better part of their own lives. Their resilience is the true, beating heart of the resolution. They didn't just wait for justice. They demanded it, they pushed for it, and they refused to allow their lost ones to become the mere statistics of a growth-driven machine. Their advocacy transformed the cold case from a private, haunting mystery into a public, moral imperative. They turned their personal grief into a collective, civic demand for transparency, and in doing so, they created the mechanisms that allowed the truth centers and the audit protocols to exist. Their story is the primary narrative of this resolution, a story of how love, persistent and unwavering, can survive the most brutal efforts of an uncaring system to erase it. The sociological autopsy of the Sterling era also forces us to address the uncomfortable reality of the bystander effect on a citywide scale. Why did it take so long? Why were the clues ignored? Why did the systems of accountability collapse so completely in the mid-80s? The answer lies not in the brilliance of Sterling's deception, but in the collective desire of a society to believe in its own progress. Phoenix was a city on the rise, a place that wanted to believe in the dream of the desert miracle, and Sterling was the perfect figurehead for that belief. The investigation taught us that the price of this collective blindness is incredibly high. We allowed the shadows to grow because we were too busy looking at the light of the new skyscrapers. This lesson is now being taught in law schools and ethics seminars across the country, serving as a permanent warning that a society which prioritizes growth over integrity is a society that is fundamentally and dangerously vulnerable. The Sterling Protocols, that chilling, business-like guide to corruption, is now the definitive exhibit of our failure, and it remains a required reading for every municipal official, urban planner, and police officer in the Southwest. It serves as a stark reminder that corruption is not a natural disaster that descends upon a city. It is a calculated, human process that can be interrupted, prevented, and countered if the people are sufficiently informed. The protocols were dismantled not by a single hero, but by the relentless, coordinated, and multidisciplinary effort of hundreds of investigators, analysts, researchers, and victims who decided, once and for all, that the silence was no longer an option. The resolution of this case proves that the architecture of corruption is only as strong as the ignorance of the citizenry, and that transparency, once unleashed, is an unstoppable force of nature. Sterling, in his isolation at the Supermax, serves as a fading, monochromatic emblem of a past we have collectively agreed to abandon. He is a man who had everything, and now he has nothing, not because of a change in his fortune, but because of a change in the perception of his reality. He was a god in his own narrative, but in the narrative of the city, in the actual, documented history of Phoenix, he is now remembered as nothing more than a small, frightened man who is driven by a pathetic, overwhelming need to control the variables of his own survival. His fall was not just a judicial victory, it was a psychological victory for the city, a way for the residents to reclaim their agency, their history, and their right to define their own future, regardless of the monuments he had left behind. As we look toward the future, the Resolution Commons serves as the physical manifestation of this reclaimed agency. It is a space where the city can gather, reflect, and grow, a space that is defined not by the shadow of the past, but by the potential of the future. The glass monument, refracting the light into the vibrant, shifting colors of the desert, is a testament to the fact that truth is not a static, singular thing, but a multifaceted, evolving reality that must be constantly and carefully observed. The mystery of 1985 has been solved, and the ghost has been returned to the history books, but the lesson of the case, the demand for a society built on the light of honesty rather than the dark of convenience, is a lesson that must be relearned by every generation. The investigation has concluded, the files are closed, and the task force has moved on, but the impact of their work is woven into the very fabric of the city. We have seen how a case that was once considered impossible can be brought to resolution through the sheer, persistent application of human intelligence and moral courage. We have seen how the legal system, when properly focused and sufficiently resourced, can reach back into the past to mend the broken promises of justice. We have seen that the shadows of the desert are not impenetrable, and that the monsters who hide there can never truly be safe from the steady, patient, and eventually all-encompassing reach of the light. In the end, the Phoenix 1985 case is the story of how a city learned to see. It learned to see the difference between the dream of the city and the reality of its foundations. It learned to see the difference between the powerful and the just. And most importantly, it learned to see the value of the individuals, like Clara Sterling, who were once thought to be easily disposable but who were, in reality, the very essence of what the city should have been. The case is a final, definitive, and resonant end to a dark chapter, but it is also the beginning of an era of, hopefully, more honest, more transparent, and more accountable growth. The ghost is gone, the mystery is solved, and the light, at last, is ours. As we close this long, complex, and deeply personal chapter of our collective history, we are left with the final, quiet certainty that truth is the only legacy that endures. The monuments we build in our hubris may crumble, the reputations we foster in our vanity may evaporate, and the lies we tell to protect our own interests may eventually turn to ash, but the truth, the simple, hard, unvarnished truth of what happened on that monsoon-heavy night in 1985, that will remain as long as we have the courage to acknowledge it. We have faced the dark, we have challenged